The air in the mine shaft tasted like copper and death, and when I heard the rhythmic tapping of a pickaxe echoing from impossibly deep below Thurber's abandoned coal tunnels, I knew something had been waiting for me. The temperature plummeted, my breath turned to fog, and then I saw it. A miner's lamp glowing through solid rock, moving closer. Subscribe to Verified Souls right now, hit that bell, and drop a comment telling us if you'd go deeper or run, because what I found beneath that ghost town is still trying to claw its way out. Philip had always been drawn to places where history died violently, and Thurber, Texas, was exactly that kind of place. The lone smokestack rose 127 feet into the gray October sky like a tombstone, marking the grave of 10,000 souls who once filled these streets with life, back when the coal mines ran deep and the company owned everything. Your house, your job, your future. He parked his truck near the crumbling brick buildings and stepped out into silence so complete it felt unnatural. The kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums and makes you want to fill it with sound just to prove you're still alive. Philip was researching his great-grandfather, a miner named Gustavo who'd worked the tunnels in 1919, and according to family letters, Gustavo had witnessed something down in those mines that drove him to leave Thurber in the middle of the night with nothing but the clothes on his back. The town stretched before Philip like a skeleton picked clean by time. The old opera house that once seated 650 people, now just walls and memories. The company store where workers spent their scrip coins because real money was forbidden. The rows of identical houses where families lived under the watchful eye of the coal company that controlled every aspect of existence. He walked the empty streets as afternoon shadows lengthened, photographing the ruins and checking his notes about the mine locations, and that's when he noticed something odd near the old rail yard, a section of ground that had collapsed inward, revealing darkness below. Philip approached carefully, testing the edges with his boot, and peered into what looked like an old mine entrance that had caved in partially, exposing a tunnel that descended into absolute blackness. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness and revealed timber supports that somehow still held despite nearly a century of neglect, and without fully understanding why, Philip found himself climbing down into the shaft, his boots finding purchase on the wooden ladder rungs that creaked but held his weight. The air changed immediately once he was below ground. It became thick and metallic, tasting of copper, and something else he couldn't identify, something organic and wrong. The tunnel stretched ahead of him, carved rough through the earth, with abandoned mining equipment scattered along the walls like relics from another world, and Philip noticed that some of the pickaxes and shovels looked as though they'd been dropped mid-swing, as if the workers had fled in sudden panic. He moved deeper, his light revealing veins of coal still embedded in the rock faces, and that's when he heard it for the first time. A distant tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate, metal striking stone in a pattern that suggested human intention. Philip froze, listening, trying to rationalize the sound as water dripping or rock settling, but the rhythm was too consistent, too purposeful, and it was getting louder. The temperature dropped so suddenly that Philip's breath became visible fog, and he watched in growing horror as frost began forming on the tunnel walls despite it being 70 degrees above ground. The tapping grew closer, echoing through the passages in a way that made it impossible to determine which direction it was coming from, and Philip backed against the wall as his light began to flicker, the batteries draining impossibly fast. Then he saw the glow, a soft orange light moving through the darkness ahead, the unmistakable illumination of an old miner's lamp, the kind that burned oil and hadn't been used since the 1920s when Thurber's mines were still operational. Philip wanted to run, every instinct screaming at him to climb back up that ladder and never look back, but something kept him rooted in place. Some need to understand what he was witnessing. The light grew brighter, and with it came the sound of footsteps, heavy boots on stone, and the continued tapping of metal on rock, and then the figure emerged from the darkness. He was a miner, dressed in the canvas work clothes and leather boots of a century past, his face blackened with coal dust and his eyes reflecting Philip's flashlight beam like an animal's eyes caught in headlights. The man carried a pickaxe in his right hand and an oil lamp in his left, and he walked with the steady gait of someone who'd spent his entire life underground, someone who knew these tunnels better than the world above. Philip tried to speak, but found his throat had closed with fear, and he watched as the miner stopped about 10 feet away and raised his pickaxe, bringing it down against the tunnel wall with a resounding crack that sent chips of rock flying. The miner struck again and again, working with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing a task they'd done 10,000 times before, and Philip realized with growing dread that the man wasn't acknowledging his presence at all. He was simply mining, exactly as he had been doing for the past 100 years. The temperature continued to drop, and Philip could see his breath coming in quick, panicked clouds, and then the miner stopped mid-swing and turned to look directly at him with eyes that held depths of sorrow and rage that no living person should have to carry. The miner's mouth opened, and words came out in a voice that sounded like gravel sliding down a metal chute, rough and painful and barely human. He said that his name was Vicente, that he'd worked these tunnels for 12 years, that he'd been part of the union organizing that swept through Thurber in 1919, when workers finally tried to stand up against the company that treated them like property rather than men. Vicente told Philip that they'd been promised better wages, safer conditions, the right to spend real money instead of the company scrip that kept them enslaved to the town. But the company bosses had other ideas about how to handle union troublemakers. The miner's spectral form began to flicker like his lamp was running low on oil, and he gestured for Philip to follow him deeper into the tunnel, down a passage that sloped sharply downward into what felt like the very bowels of the earth. Philip knew he should refuse, knew he should run back to the surface world, where the sun still existed and the dead stayed buried. But Vicente's eyes held something that looked like desperate pleading, and Philip found his feet moving forward almost against his will. They descended for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the tunnel growing narrower and more claustrophobic with each step, and Philip had to duck his head to avoid the low ceiling that pressed down with the weight of centuries. Vicente's lamp provided the only light now since Philip's flashlight had died completely, leaving him dependent on a ghost to guide him through the darkness. They reached a chamber where the tunnel opened up into a larger space, and Vicente held his lamp high, illuminating a sight that made Philip's stomach turn and his mind rebel against what his eyes were showing him. There were bodies, dozens of them, lying in various positions of final rest, their miners' clothing still intact, their pickaxes and shovels scattered around them like toys abandoned by children called home for dinner. These weren't ancient skeletons picked clean by time. These were preserved corpses, kept perfectly intact by the cold, dry air of the deep tunnels, their faces still showing the expressions of shock and pain they'd worn in their final moments. Vicente moved among them, touching each one gently on the shoulder like a roll call of the dead, and he spoke their names in that terrible grinding voice: Dario, Hassan, Mauricio, Danny, Eliseo, men who'd stood together for their rights and paid the ultimate price. Philip finally found his voice and asked what had happened to them, though part of him already knew the answer. Vicente turned to face him fully, and in the lamplight his features became clearer, more defined, and Philip could see the family resemblance that made his blood run cold. This was Gustavo's brother, his great-great-uncle, a man whose existence had been erased from family history for reasons that were now becoming horrifically clear. Vicente explained that the company had waited until night shift, when this crew of union organizers was working the deepest tunnel. Then they'd collapsed the entrance, sealing them in with no possibility of escape or rescue. The men had died slowly over the course of days, their air running out, their lamp oil burning down to nothing, their desperate attempts to dig themselves out ultimately futile against tons of deliberately placed rock and timber. Vicente said that Gustavo had been supposed to work that shift but had gotten sick with fever, and when he'd come to the mine the next day and found the entrance collapsed with his brother and friends inside, he'd understood immediately what the company had done. The bosses had told everyone it was a tragic accident, an unfortunate cave-in, one of the risks of mining work, and they'd paid the family's small settlements in company scrip and forbidden anyone from attempting to recover the bodies. Gustavo had tried to tell the truth, tried to get authorities to investigate, but the company owned the sheriff and the mayor and everyone else who mattered, so he'd fled Thurber before they could silence him, the same way they'd silenced his brother. Vicente reached out with one translucent hand and gripped Philip's arm with surprising strength, and Philip felt the bone-deep cold of that touch spreading through his body like ice water in his veins. The ghost told him that they'd been waiting down here for someone to find them, someone who could tell their story, someone who could finally give them the justice they'd been denied for over a century. Philip stammered that he would, that he'd tell everyone what had happened here, that he'd make sure the world knew about the murders that had been covered up and forgotten, and Vicente's grip loosened as something like relief passed across his coal-stained features. The miner told him to take the old union organizing papers that were tucked in his jacket pocket, papers that named names and documented the company's threats, papers that had been preserved by the same dry cold that had kept the bodies from decay. Philip reached out with shaking hands and felt the brittle paper crackle under his fingers as he pulled documents from Vicente's jacket, and the moment he had them secured in his own pocket, the lamp began to dim. Vicente and the other miners started to fade, their forms becoming more translucent with each passing second, and Philip realized that they'd held on to this existence for 100 years just to pass their truth to someone who could carry it back to the surface. The lamp went out completely, plunging Philip into absolute darkness, and he stood there, in the chamber of the dead, feeling panic rise in his throat as he realized he had no light and no idea how to find his way back to the entrance. But then he felt it, a gentle pressure on his back, a push in a specific direction, and he understood that the miners were guiding him one last time. He walked through the darkness with his hands outstretched, following the invisible guidance that steered him away from dead ends and dangerous drops. And after what felt like an eternity, he saw a gray light ahead, the blessed sight of the collapsed entrance with late afternoon sun filtering through. Philip climbed out of that hole like a man escaping his own grave, gasping for air that didn't taste like death and copper, and he didn't stop running until he reached his truck. He drove away from Thurber with the union papers burning like hot coals in his pocket, and he kept his promise to Vicente and the others. Philip contacted historians and journalists, provided the documents that proved the company had murdered union organizers and covered it up, and within months the story had spread across Texas and beyond. The State Historical Commission launched an investigation, recovered the bodies from the deep tunnel, and gave Vicente, Dario, Hassan, Mauricio, Danny, Eliseo, and the others proper burials with markers that named them as victims of corporate murder rather than mining accidents. Philip attended every funeral, watched as descendants he'd helped locate wept over graves that should have been dug a century earlier, and he felt Vicente's cold hand on his shoulder one last time during the final burial. A touch of gratitude, a touch of farewell. He never went back to Thurber, never descended into another abandoned mine, because some debts to the dead can only be paid once, and some ghosts deserve to finally rest after carrying their truth through 100 years of darkness. The smokestack still stands over Thurber, like a monument to all the souls who were used up and discarded by the coal that made other men rich. And on quiet nights, when the wind blows just right, people say you can still hear the sound of pickaxes tapping against stone, the rhythm of men who refuse to be forgotten. Carolina never believed in curses until she spent 3 days in Helena, Texas, and by the time she left, she understood that some grudges burned so hot they scorched the earth for generations. She was a paranormal investigator with a YouTube channel that had modest success, and when she'd received an anonymous email about Helena, a ghost town in Karnes County where violent deaths replayed themselves every October, she'd packed her equipment and driven south without hesitation. The town appeared suddenly after miles of empty Texas scrubland, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around what had once been a courthouse square, and Carolina felt the wrongness of the place immediately, like static electricity making the hair on her arms stand up. Helena had been the county seat in the 1850s, a prosperous settlement of ranchers and merchants, but it had died in a way that towns rarely do, not from economic collapse or natural disaster, but from pure human spite. She set up her recording equipment in the abandoned square as the sun began its descent, painting the ruins in shades of blood orange and purple, and she started her introduction explaining that Helena had been known as one of the toughest towns in Texas, a place where disputes were settled with knives rather than words. The historical research Carolina had done revealed a culture of violence that seemed incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. Helena had been famous for its duels, but not the gentleman's pistols at dawn kind that happened in European cities. Here they fought with Bowie knives, and the combatants had their left hands tied together with leather straps so they couldn't retreat, forcing them to slash and stab at each other while crowds gathered to place bets on who would bleed out first. Carolina walked the perimeter of the courthouse square where these duels had taken place, her thermal camera showing nothing unusual, her EMF reader quiet, and she was beginning to think the anonymous tip had been a waste of time when the temperature dropped 20 degrees in the span of 3 seconds. She spun around, her breath suddenly visible in the warm October air, and she saw them materializing in the fading light, translucent figures dressed in 1850s clothing, forming a circle in the exact center of the square. Carolina's hands shook as she raised her camera, capturing footage that she knew would either make her career or get her labeled as a fraud, and she watched as 2 men stepped into the center of the ghostly crowd, their faces twisted with hatred that felt palpable even across the barrier of death. The spectral duel began without preamble, the 2 men's left hands bound together with a leather strap that looked solid enough to be real, and they circled each other with knives that gleamed despite being composed of nothing but memory and rage. Carolina could hear the crowd shouting now, their voices echoing strangely as if coming from underwater, placing bets and calling for blood with an enthusiasm that made her stomach turn. The fighters lunged and parried, their blades leaving trails of phosphorescent light in the air, and Carolina realized she was witnessing something that transcended typical paranormal activity. This wasn't a residual haunting, a mere recording, replaying endlessly. These spirits were aware, engaged, reliving their violence with full consciousness of what they were doing. One of the fighters, a tall man with a scar across his jaw, managed to drive his knife into his opponent's ribs, and the other man, younger, with Xiomara's eyes according to the family resemblance Carolina had researched, stumbled and fell, blood that looked black in the ghostly light spreading across his shirt. The crowd erupted in cheers and groans, depending on which way they'd bet, and money changed hands between dead men's fingers. And then the whole scene flickered and reset like someone had pressed rewind on a video. Carolina watched the duel replay 3 more times, each iteration identical to the last, before the spirits finally faded as full darkness fell. She stood alone in the square with her equipment capturing data that would take weeks to analyze, and she felt the weight of the violence that had soaked into this ground over decades of knife fights and blood sport. But the duels were only part of Helena's story, and Carolina knew from her research that the town's real death had come from a vendetta that made the knife fights look civilized by comparison. A man named Colonel William Butler had lived in Helena with his family, including his son Emmett, who was beloved by everyone who knew him. a young man of 23 with his whole future ahead of him. In 1852, Emmett had been standing on a Helena street when a stray bullet from a drunken argument had struck him in the head, killing him instantly, and Colonel Butler had sworn that Helena itself would pay the price for his son's death. Carolina walked to the site where the Butler home had stood, now just a foundation outline choked with weeds, and she set up her equipment again as midnight approached, the witching hour when the veil supposedly grew thinnest. The air grew heavy with an oppressive presence that made breathing difficult, and Carolina's equipment began to malfunction in ways that suggested massive electromagnetic interference. Her voice recorder picked up words in a man's voice, cultured and educated but dripping with venom, speaking about revenge and railroad routes and the death of towns. Carolina felt cold fingers trace down her spine despite being completely alone, and then she heard footsteps behind her, heavy boots on ground that should have been silent dirt. She turned slowly, every horror movie instinct screaming at her not to look, and she saw him standing 20 feet away in the ruins of what had been his home. Colonel Butler, tall and aristocratic even in death, his eyes burning with a hatred that had survived over a century and a half. He didn't speak with his mouth, but Carolina heard his words directly in her mind, a psychic assault that made her knees buckle. He told her that Helena had taken his son, his only boy, his heir, and his pride, and so he had taken Helena in return. The colonel had used his political connections and his wealth to ensure that when the railroad came through Karnes County, it bypassed Helena entirely, routing instead through a new settlement that would become Karnes City, 7 miles away. Without the railroad, Helena had been doomed, and Butler had watched with satisfaction as businesses closed, families moved away, and the courthouse that had witnessed his son's death was eventually dismantled and moved to the new county seat. The colonel told Carolina that he had cursed this ground, sworn that Helena would never rise again, that the violence that had killed Emmett would replay eternally as punishment for the town's sins. Carolina tried to speak, to ask questions, to do the job she'd come here to do, but the psychic pressure from Butler's spirit was crushing, forcing her to her knees in the dirt of his former home. She felt his rage pouring into her mind, the rage of a father who had lost everything that mattered, who had turned his grief into a weapon that had destroyed an entire community. The spirits of the duel fighters appeared again, along with dozens of others, the ghosts of Helena's residents trapped in an endless cycle of their worst moments because one man's vendetta had poisoned the very ground they walked on. Carolina saw Sarai, a woman who died in childbirth in 1854, perpetually screaming in labor that would never end. She saw Sean, a merchant who'd hanged himself when his business failed after the railroad bypassed the town, his body swinging from a spectral rope for all eternity. The visions came faster now, overwhelming Carolina's ability to process them. She saw the original residents, many of them Mexican and Spanish settlers, their graves marked with crosses in the old cemetery that still existed on Helena's outskirts, and she understood that Butler's curse had trapped them all regardless of whether they'd been present when Emmett died. The colonel's spirit grew larger, more solid, feeding on Carolina's fear and the ambient violence that saturated the location, and she realized with horror that he intended to add her to his collection of eternally suffering souls. Her equipment sparked and died, her cameras going dark, her EMF readers frying their circuits, and Carolina was left with nothing but her own will, standing between her and becoming another ghost story in Helena's repertoire. She forced herself to stand despite the psychic pressure trying to crush her into the ground, and she screamed at Butler that his son's death had been an accident. A tragedy, yes, but not a crime that justified destroying innocent lives. The colonel's form wavered, and for just a moment Carolina saw past the rage to the broken father underneath, the man who had loved his son so desperately that losing him had shattered something fundamental in his soul. Carolina pressed her advantage, speaking in a voice that came out stronger than she felt, telling Butler that Emmett wouldn't have wanted this, wouldn't have wanted his father to become a monster who tortured the dead and cursed the living. She said that the real way to honor Emmett's memory was to let Helena's spirits go, to release them from the cycle of violence and vengeance that served no purpose except to perpetuate suffering. For a long moment, nothing happened, and Carolina thought she'd failed, thought she'd made everything worse by challenging a spirit powerful enough to curse an entire town. But then Butler's form began to crack like old porcelain, fissures of light appearing in the spectral body, and through those cracks, Carolina saw not the vengeful colonel, but a tired old man who'd been carrying his grief for over 170 years. The spirits of the duel fighters stopped their endless battle and turned to look at Butler, their expressions shifting from perpetual rage to something like hope. And Sarai's screams finally ceased as the laboring woman found a peace she'd been denied since 1854. Sean's hanging body dissolved into particles of light that drifted upward like fireflies, and all across Helena, the trapped dead began to fade, released at last from Butler's curse. The colonel looked at Carolina one final time, and she saw in his ghostly eyes a mixture of gratitude and sorrow, the acknowledgement that she'd given him permission to do what he'd been unable to do himself. Let go. He whispered a name that Carolina barely caught. Dorothy, his wife, who had died of grief 6 months after Emmett and had been waiting for him to join her for over a century and a half. Then Colonel Butler dissolved into the October night. His vendetta finally ended, his curse lifted, and Carolina collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air like she'd been drowning. She lay there for several minutes, her body shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. And when she finally gathered the strength to check her equipment, she found that every device had been completely destroyed, their circuits melted, their batteries drained beyond recovery. The only evidence she had of what had happened was her own memory and the profound silence that now filled Helena. Not the oppressive quiet that had greeted her arrival, but a peaceful stillness that suggested the dead had finally found rest. Carolina left Helena as the sun rose, driving away from the ghost town that was now truly just ruins in history rather than a prison for tormented souls. She never published the footage she hadn't been able to capture, never told her YouTube audience about the investigation that had ended with destroyed equipment and no evidence, but she did write an article for a historical journal about Colonel Butler and Emmett, and the curse that had killed a town more thoroughly than any drought or economic disaster ever could. She included what she'd learned from the spirits, that Emmett's death hadn't been quite as random as history suggested, that the drunken argument had actually been a dispute over a card game involving a man named Dax, who had deliberately aimed at another player named Camden, but had missed and killed the innocent Emmett instead. Carolina made sure that truth was recorded, gave Emmett's death the context it had been denied, and she hoped that wherever Colonel Butler's spirit had gone, he'd found his son and his wife, and the peace that vengeance had never been able to provide. She never returned to Helena, but she heard from locals that the town felt different now, that the oppressive atmosphere had lifted, that people could visit the ruins without feeling like they were being watched by hostile eyes. The Latin cemetery, with its Spanish tombstones from the 1800s, became a place of historical interest rather than supernatural dread, and the courthouse square where knife fighters had died for entertainment was just empty ground where wildflowers grew in spring. Carolina knew she'd done something important in Helena, something that transcended ghost hunting or YouTube views. She'd helped break a cycle of violence and grief that had poisoned a place for generations, and sometimes that was worth more than any evidence or fame. The curse was lifted, the vendetta ended, and Helena could finally rest. The scratching sound came from inside walls that shouldn't exist anymore, and that's when Arleth knew she'd made a terrible mistake coming to Belle Plain alone. She was a graduate student specializing in frontier education, writing her dissertation on failed colleges in the American West, and Belle Plain College had seemed like the perfect case study. a school that had offered everything from astronomy to music in the middle of nowhere, Texas, only to vanish when the railroad chose a different route and left the town to die of thirst and broken dreams. Arleth had arrived at the ruins in late afternoon, parking her car near what remained of the college's main building, a hollowed-out stone structure with window frames that gaped like empty eye sockets and walls that somehow still stood despite over a century of neglect. The October sun was already sinking toward the horizon, painting the abandoned town in shades of amber and rust, and Arleth had told herself she'd just take some photographs and measurements before driving back to Abilene for the night. But there was something magnetic about the ruins, something that pulled at her with an urgency she couldn't explain, and before she fully realized what she was doing, Arleth had unloaded her camping gear and decided to spend the night among the bones of Belle Plain's educational dreams. The town had been substantial once, serving as the Callahan County seat with a proper courthouse and businesses and families who believed they were building something permanent in the harsh Texas landscape. Belle Plain College had been the crown jewel, a source of pride for the entire region, offering an education that rivaled schools in much larger cities. And according to historical records, the students had come from across Texas to study here. Arleth walked through what had been the main academic building, her footsteps echoing strangely in the roofless structure, and she could almost see the classrooms that had once filled these spaces. Students bent over astronomy charts, music students practicing scales, literature classes discussing Shakespeare under the guidance of professors who'd traveled from the East Coast to teach on the frontier. She found remnants of the college everywhere she looked, pieces of slate that had been blackboards, fragments of textbooks with pages so brittle they crumbled at her touch, even a few desks carved with initials that students had left behind when the school closed its doors forever in 1892. The sun set faster than Arleth had anticipated, and suddenly she was setting up her tent in near darkness, her flashlight beam creating strange shadows that danced across the stone walls like figures moving just beyond the edge of vision. Arleth settled into her sleeping bag around 9 o'clock, exhausted from the drive and the exploration, and she fell asleep quickly despite the hard ground beneath her and the October wind that whistled through the empty buildings. She didn't know what time it was when the scratching woke her, only that it was deep night and her tent was illuminated by moonlight that made everything look silver and unreal. The sound was unmistakable, something scraping against stone, rhythmic and purposeful, coming from somewhere very close. Arleth's first thought was an animal, maybe a coyote or raccoon investigating the ruins, but then she heard something else underneath the scratching. Voices, young voices, whispering urgently in a way that suggested students trying not to get caught talking after lights out. She unzipped her tent slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs, and she stepped out into the Belle Plain night to find the ruins transformed. The college building wasn't a hollowed shell anymore, but a complete structure, its roof intact, its windows glowing with the soft light of oil lamps and candles, and through those windows Arleth could see movement. Figures bent over desks, writing frantically, their faces tight with concentration and something that looked like desperation. Arleth approached the building that couldn't be whole, and she peered through one of the windows to see a classroom full of students who couldn't have been older than 18 or 20, dressed in the high-collared shirts and long skirts of the 1890s. They were taking an examination. That much was clear from the papers spread before them and the way they wrote without pause, and Arleth recognized the intensity on their faces. She'd worn that same expression during her own final exams, that mixture of determination and fear and desperate hope that you'd studied the right material. One of the students, a young woman who looked exactly like what Salem might have looked like in the 1890s, glanced up and made direct eye contact with Arleth through the window, and the terror in those eyes was so profound that Arleth stumbled backward. The student mouthed something that Arleth couldn't hear through the glass, but she could read the words on those lips clearly enough. "Help us. Please help us finish." The scratching sound intensified, and Arlith realized it was coming from everywhere now, from every window of the phantom building, the sound of dozens of pencils and pens scratching against paper, students racing against time to complete examinations that would determine their futures. Arleth's rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that she was hallucinating or dreaming or suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning despite being outdoors. But her body moved forward, of its own accord, drawn by the desperation radiating from the spectral students. She found the front entrance standing open and walked inside to find hallways that shouldn't exist, lined with classrooms full of frantic young people taking exams in subjects ranging from Latin to mathematics to natural philosophy. Every student she passed looked up at her with the same pleading expression, the same desperate need to communicate something vitally important, and Arlith felt their collective anguish like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. She found herself in what had been the main examination hall, a large room where at least 30 students sat at individual desks, and at the front of the room stood a figure that made Arlith's blood run cold, a professor, tall and severe, dressed in black academic robes, holding a pocket watch and staring at it with an expression of growing horror. The professor looked up as Arlith entered, and when he spoke, his voice sounded like wind through dry grass, barely audible and infinitely sad. He introduced himself as Professor Chris, head of natural sciences at Belle Plain College, and he told Arlith that they'd been taking final examinations in June of 1892 when the illness had come. Typhoid fever, sweeping through the college with devastating speed, and it had struck in the middle of examination week when students were already exhausted and stressed and vulnerable. The students had kept taking their tests even as they grew feverish, even as their hands shook and their vision blurred, because completing their examinations meant graduating, meant certificates and degrees and futures that would lift them out of poverty or give them opportunities their parents had never had. Professor Chris said that Dorothy had been the first to collapse, her head hitting her desk with a sound that had made everyone look up in alarm, and within hours, half the class was showing symptoms. They'd tried to postpone the examinations, tried to send students home to recover, but the fever had moved too fast, and the medical care available in frontier Texas had been woefully inadequate. By the time the outbreak ended, 17 students had died without completing their finals, their dreams of graduation and better lives dying with them, and Professor Chris himself had succumbed 3 days after the last student passed. Arlith felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to the professor's story, and she watched the spectral students continuing to write their examinations with shaking hands, some of them visibly feverish even in death, their commitment to education so strong that it had bound them to this place for over a century. Professor Chris told her that they'd been trapped here ever since, reliving examination week over and over, never able to finish because the illness always claimed them before time was called, an eternal cycle of hope and failure and death. Arlith asked what she could do, how she could help them break free, and the professor's ghostly face showed something like hope for the first time. He said that they needed someone to bear witness, someone to record that they had been here, that they had tried so desperately to learn and grow and make something of themselves, that their deaths hadn't been meaningless even though history had forgotten them. He needed Arlith to write their names, to document what they'd been studying, to give them the recognition that a diploma would have provided if they'd lived long enough to receive one. Arlith pulled out her notebook and pen with hands that shook almost as badly as the spectral students, and she began moving through the examination hall, writing down every name that Professor Chris provided. There was Salem studying literature, Florence working on advanced mathematics, Melanie translating Latin texts, Rain focused on astronomy, Bonnie in the music program, Kalia studying natural philosophy, and on through 30 names of students whose potential had been stolen by disease and circumstance. Professor Chris walked with her, adding details about each student, their hometowns, their dreams, the families who had sacrificed to send them to college. He told her about Saig, who wanted to be a teacher, about Opal, who hoped to study medicine, despite it being nearly impossible for women at the time, about Demi, who was the first in her family to read and had been determined to bring education back to her community. Each name felt like a weight lifting from the phantom building, and as Arleth wrote, the walls began to shimmer and fade, the oil lamps growing dimmer, the scratching of pens on paper gradually quieting. The last name Professor Chris gave her was his own, Christopher Wilson, formerly of Boston, Massachusetts, who had come to Texas because he believed that education should reach every corner of the country, not just the privileged cities of the East. Arleth wrote his name carefully, adding details about his dedication to his students and his belief that learning was the pathway to a better world, and as she finished the final letter, the professor smiled at her with an expression of profound relief. He told her that they could rest now, that being remembered was enough, that she'd given them the graduation they'd been denied by allowing their stories to be recorded and preserved. The spectral students began to stand from their desks, setting down their pens, and one by one they approached Arleth to touch her hand or shoulder in thanks. Salem first, then Florence, and Melanie, and Rain, and all the others, each touch cold but somehow comforting. And then they began to fade, like morning mist burned away by the rising sun. Professor Chris was the last to go, and before he disappeared completely, he pressed something into Arleth's hand, a piece of chalk that felt solid despite coming from a ghost, and he told her to write their names on the college walls so that anyone who came to Belle Plain would know that students had learned and dreamed and died here. Then he too faded, and Arleth was alone in the ruins again. The building, just a roofless shell once more. The windows empty frames, but the piece of chalk in her hand was real and solid and impossible. She spent the rest of the night and most of the next morning carefully writing every single name on the college walls in letters large enough to read from a distance, and under each name she wrote what they'd been studying and where they'd been from. Salem from Austin studying literature, Florence from Dallas studying mathematics, Melanie from San Antonio studying Latin, and 27 more names representing 27 lost futures. When Arleth finally left Belle Plain 2 days later, exhausted and emotionally drained, but certain she'd done something important, she took photographs of every name she'd written and began the long process of researching each student in historical records. She found most of them eventually, located their families' genealogies, discovered that some had siblings who'd gone on to become teachers or doctors or business people, carrying forward the dreams the typhoid had stolen from the Belle Plain students. Arleth's dissertation became a book that was published by a university press, and an entire chapter was dedicated to the Belle Plain College typhoid outbreak of 1892 and the 30 students and one professor who had died pursuing education on the Texas frontier. She arranged for historical markers to be placed at the ruins, and she established a small scholarship fund named after Professor Christopher Wilson for first-generation college students studying education. Arleth never told anyone about the spectral examination hall or the ghostly students who had begged her to help them finish, but she visited Belle Plain every year on the anniversary of the outbreak to lay wildflowers at the college ruins and read the names aloud from the walls where she'd written them in impossible chalk. The scratching sounds never returned, and visitors to the ruins reported feeling a sense of peace rather than the oppressive desperation that had hung over the place for decades. The students had finally graduated, their names recorded and remembered, their dedication to learning honored, even though death had claimed them before they could walk across a stage to receive their diplomas. Belle Plain remained abandoned, the railroad that had never come, ensuring the town's death just as certainly as typhoid had claimed the college's students, but the ruins were no longer haunted by unfulfilled dreams. They were simply a memorial to the price that frontier education had demanded and the young people who had been willing to pay it. And sometimes that was the best kind of immortality that history could offer. The coffee in the cafe was still warm when Elisa pushed open the door, steam rising from cups that sat abandoned on tables as if the customers had simply evaporated mid-conversation. She'd driven to Toyah expecting a typical Texas ghost town, collapsed buildings, empty lots, maybe some rusted equipment. But what she found instead was a place frozen in time. A town that looked like everyone had disappeared in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon and never returned. Elisa was a journalist investigating strange phenomena for an online publication, and the tips she'd received about Toyah had been too intriguing to ignore. Reports of buildings standing fully intact with furniture still inside, tables set for meals that were never eaten, clothing hanging in closets, books open to pages that would never be finished. The town stood in Reeves County in far west Texas, and as Elisa walked down the main street in the fading October light, she felt the wrongness of the place settling into her bones like a chill. There were 4 churches, their doors standing open to reveal pews with hymnals placed precisely as if waiting for Sunday service, and 2 hotels with their registers still on the front desks, showing the last guests who had checked in sometime in the early 1990s, before Toyah had simply ceased to function as a living community. Elisa entered the old Toyah High School and found classrooms that made her skin crawl with their eerie preservation. Desks in neat rows, a chalkboard with a math equation half erased, textbooks stacked on shelves that should have been looted or deteriorated decades ago. She took photographs with hands that trembled slightly, documenting the impossible normalcy of a place that everyone had abandoned without explanation. The official story was that Toyah had declined economically, that people had moved away for better opportunities. But that didn't explain why they'd left everything behind, why homes still had dishes in the cupboards and photographs on the walls. Elisa had researched the town's history and found nothing that justified this kind of mass abandonment. No environmental disaster, no economic collapse dramatic enough to make an entire population flee without taking their possessions. No epidemic or violence that would explain the exodus. Toyah had simply emptied out, and the buildings had remained standing like a stage set waiting for actors who would never return to perform. The sun was setting now, and Elisa knew she should leave, drive back to Pecos, where she'd booked a motel room. But something kept her in Toyah as darkness fell and the streetlights flickered on impossibly, running on electricity that shouldn't exist in an abandoned town. That's when Elisa saw her first time slip, though she didn't recognize it as such initially. Movement caught her eye in the window of what had been a general store, and when she turned to look directly at it, she saw a woman inside arranging goods on shelves, wearing a dress that looked like it came from the 1880s, high-necked, long-sleeved, completely out of place in any modern context. Elisa blinked, and the woman was gone, the store empty again, except for bare shelves and dust. But her heart was racing because she knew what she'd seen had been real, or at least as real as anything in Toyah could be. She approached the store slowly, her journalist's instincts warring with her survival instincts, and she peered through the window into a space that seemed to flicker between empty abandonment and bustling activity. For just a moment, the store was full again. Shelves stocked with goods, a counter with a cash register, customers browsing. The woman she'd seen serving them with a smile, and then it was empty ruins once more. Elisa stumbled backward and nearly collided with someone spinning around with a gasp to find a man standing behind her on the sidewalk, dressed in modern clothing and looking just as startled as she was. His name was Crew, he said, and he was a photographer who'd come to Toyah for the same reason Elisa had, the inexplicable preservation and the rumors of something strange happening in this empty West Texas town. They compared notes quickly, both relieved to find another living person in the uncanny stillness, and Crew told her he'd been seeing things too. figures in windows that disappeared when he looked directly at them, sounds of children playing that cut off abruptly, the sense that Toyah existed in multiple time periods simultaneously. Elisa suggested they stick together, safety in numbers and all that, and they began exploring the town systematically as night deepened around them. The time slips became more frequent and more vivid as the hours passed. They'd turn a corner, and suddenly the street would be full of people in 1880s clothing going about their business, horse-drawn wagons rolling past, the sound of a blacksmith's hammer ringing from a shop that was just an empty shell in their timeline. Then they'd blink, and it would all vanish, leaving them alone in the silent present, with only streetlights that shouldn't work, casting pools of yellow illumination on empty pavement. Elisa and crew found themselves drawn to the largest of the hotels, a 3-story building that dominated one end of the main street, and they entered through a front door that opened smoothly despite decades of disuse. The lobby was furnished as if guests might arrive at any moment. Chairs arranged around tables, a registration desk with a bell that actually dinged when Elisa touched it experimentally, keys hanging on hooks behind the desk, labeled with room numbers. They climbed the stairs to the second floor, and that's when the time slips stopped being brief glimpses and became something more immersive and terrifying. The hallway they walked down flickered between empty abandonment and fully occupied hotel, and suddenly they could hear voices behind the room doors, conversations, laughter, the ordinary, sounds of people living their lives. Crew reached for one of the doorknobs, but Elisa grabbed his hand to stop him, some instinct warning her that opening those doors would be a mistake they couldn't undo. They backed away toward the stairs, but the hallway had changed, lengthening impossibly, the exit receding with each step they took, as if the hotel itself didn't want them to leave. A door opened behind them without anyone touching the knob, and both Elisa and crew turned to see a woman standing in the doorway, dressed in clothing from the 1880s, her face showing a mixture of urgency and warning. She looked like Rain might have looked if she'd been born a century and a half ago, and she gestured frantically for them to come closer, even as Elisa's every instinct screamed to run. The woman spoke in a voice that sounded distant and echoing, and she told them that Toyah wasn't abandoned. It had been displaced, caught between different moments in time when something had gone wrong with the fabric of reality itself. She said the residents hadn't left. They'd been scattered across different temporal layers, existing simultaneously in the 1880s and the 1990s, and every decade in between, unable to interact with their own timeline, but occasionally glimpsing other eras through the cracks. The woman, she said her name was Nyla, explained that she'd lived in Toyah in 1883, had gone to sleep one night and awakened to find the town changed, the buildings different, strange devices everywhere that she didn't understand, and then she'd blinked and been back in her own time, but with the terrible knowledge that something fundamental had broken. Elisa felt her grip on reality loosening as Nyla spoke, and she asked the question that seemed most urgent. How did they leave without getting trapped in the temporal displacement like the original residents? Nyla's expression became even more frightened, and she told them that the town didn't let people go easily, that visitors who stayed past sunset sometimes found themselves slipping into different time periods permanently, becoming part of Toyah's fractured existence. She said they needed to leave immediately before midnight, because that's when the temporal boundaries became most unstable, and people got pulled fully into the wrong timeline with no way back. Elisa checked her phone and felt her stomach drop. It was 11:47 p.m., and she had no idea how it had gotten so late when they'd only been exploring for what felt like an hour or two. Crew grabbed her arm, and they ran for the stairs, but the hotel fought them every step of the way, hallways twisting into configurations that shouldn't be geometrically possible, doors appearing where there had been walls, the sound of footsteps following them from every direction, as the displaced residents of multiple eras became aware of their presence. They burst out of the hotel at 11:53 p.m. according to Elisa's phone, and they sprinted for their vehicles, only to find the entire town had changed around them. Toyah was full now, every building occupied, people on the streets in clothing from at least 6 different time periods, all existing simultaneously. Cowboys from the 1880s walking past women in 1950s dresses, children in 1990s clothing playing alongside men in Prohibition-era suits. The temporal layers had collapsed into each other, and Elisa realized with horror that she could see through some of the people, that they were becoming translucent and ghostly, even as others seemed solid and real. Time itself had become unstable in Toyah, and she and crew were caught in the breakdown, their own bodies starting to feel strange and disconnected, as if parts of them were existing in different moments. Crew shouted something that Elisa couldn't quite hear, his voice echoing weirdly across multiple timelines, and he pointed toward the edge of town where their cars were parked, in what she desperately hoped was still their original timeline. They ran through streets that changed with each step, past buildings that flickered through decades of different facades and purposes, and the displaced residents of Toyah reached out to them as they passed, not threatening, but pleading, desperate hands trying to touch them, voices begging for help to return to their proper times. Elisa saw Emmy crying on a porch that existed in the 1890s, saw Cameron working in a shop from the 1920s, saw Lorelei walking down a street that belonged to the 1960s, all of them trapped in wrong eras, while their actual timelines existed somewhere else in Toyah's fractured reality. Elisa wanted to help them, wanted to find a way to fix whatever had broken time in this place, but crew was pulling her forward, and her phone showed 11:58 p.m., and she knew with absolute certainty that if they didn't escape in the next 2 minutes, they would be staying in Toyah forever, scattered across its temporal layers like everyone else who'd been caught in the displacement. They reached their cars just as Elisa's phone ticked over to midnight, and she threw herself into her driver's seat with crew diving into his own vehicle beside her, and they drove out of Toyah without looking back, their tires kicking up dust on a road that seemed to stretch and warp beneath them. Elisa didn't stop driving until she reached Pecos 20 miles away, and when she pulled into the motel parking lot and finally looked in her rearview mirror, she saw crew's headlights right behind her, confirming that they'd both made it out. They sat in the motel lobby until dawn, drinking terrible coffee and trying to process what they'd experienced. And when the sun finally rose, they drove back to Toyah together, needing to see it in daylight, needing to confirm what they'd witnessed hadn't been some shared hallucination. The town looked different in morning light, still abandoned, still eerily preserved, but stable and solid without any temporal flickering. They walked the same streets they'd run down in, terror, and there was no sign of the displaced residents, no buildings changing between different eras, just an empty Texas ghost town slowly returning to the earth. But Elisa noticed something that made her blood run cold. There were new objects that hadn't been there the day before, modern items mixed in with the older ones, a smartphone on a table that was the same model as Crew's, a woman's jacket draped over a chair that looked exactly like the one Elisa had been wearing. They'd left pieces of themselves in Toyah's fractured timeline, and Elisa understood that part of them was still there, caught in the temporal displacement, existing simultaneously in October 2025 and scattered across the town's multiple eras. They left Toyah for the final time and never returned, but Elisa sometimes felt herself slipping, losing time in ways that couldn't be explained by normal distraction, finding herself holding objects she didn't remember picking up, wearing clothes she didn't recall putting on. Crew reported the same experiences, moments where he existed in 2 places at once, glimpses of himself walking down streets he'd never been to in his waking life, the sense that part of his consciousness was still trapped in that West Texas town experiencing all of its timelines simultaneously. Elisa wrote her article, but her editor refused to publish it, said it was too unbelievable even for their paranormal-focused publication, so she posted it on her personal blog, where it gathered a small following of people who claimed to have experienced similar temporal anomalies in other abandoned places. She received emails from others who'd visited Toyah and barely escaped, stories that matched her own experience too closely to be coincidence, and she began to understand that the town was still active, still catching the unwary and scattering them across its fractured existence. The official explanation remained economic decline, but Elisa knew the truth was far stranger and more terrifying. Toyah hadn't been abandoned. It had been shattered across time itself, and everyone who'd ever lived there still existed somewhere in its multiple overlapping realities, unable to escape and unable to die, trapped forever in a town where yesterday and tomorrow and today all happened at once. She kept the photographs she'd taken, proof that she'd been there, but when she looked at them, she sometimes saw figures in the backgrounds that hadn't been visible when she'd taken the shots. Shadowy people waving from windows, children playing in streets that had been empty, and sometimes, most disturbing of all, she saw herself and crew among those figures, trapped in Toyah's timeline, while their physical bodies had escaped to continue living in the normal world, forever divided between two realities, with no way to reunite the pieces. Catalina had photographed abandoned places across 3 continents, but she'd never seen a figure that tall, that impossibly thin, that fundamentally wrong, standing at the end of a Texas main street like it owned the entire town. She'd arrived in Paducah in northwest Texas following a tip from an urban explorer forum about a ghost town that was unusually well preserved, and the description had been accurate. The building stood intact along the main drag, a grand hotel with its facade still proud despite decades of emptiness, a movie theater with posters somehow still clinging to the walls, department stores with display windows that should have been shattered but remained whole. Paducah wasn't completely abandoned according to the maps. Supposedly, a few dozen people still lived here, but Catalina hadn't seen a single soul since she'd arrived 3 hours ago, and the silence was the kind that made her ears ring with the absence of sound. She'd been systematically photographing storefronts when she'd turned a corner and seen it. The figure, hooded and robed in fabric that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, standing perfectly still at the far end of the street like a dark exclamation point against the fading afternoon sky. Catalina's first instinct was to call out, to ask if the person needed help, but something about the wrongness of its proportions stopped the words in her throat. The figure had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller, with a body shape that suggested something stretched like taffy until human anatomy stopped making sense. Catalina raised her camera with shaking hands and zoomed in through the viewfinder, trying to get a better look at what she was seeing, and through the lens she could see that the hood concealed nothing but darkness, no face visible even with the magnification. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence, just stood there with an absolute stillness that no living thing could maintain, and Catalina felt fear spreading through her body like ice water in her veins. Every rational part of her mind screamed at her to get back in her car and drive away from Paducah as fast as possible, but she'd built her entire career on documenting the strange and abandoned, and this was exactly the kind of thing her followers live for. She lowered her camera and took a step forward, then another, her boots echoing loudly on the empty street, and the figure remained motionless, but somehow gave the impression of watching her, despite having no visible eyes. Catalina called out, asking who they were and if they lived in Paducah, and her voice sounded small and swallowed by the oppressive quiet that hung over the town like a shroud. The figure turned without moving, a disturbing rotation that happened too smoothly to be natural body mechanics, and then it glided rather than walked down a side street, disappearing behind a building before Catalina could fully process what she'd witnessed. She stood frozen, for a long moment, her heart hammering against her ribs, and then her curiosity won out over her fear, and she followed the direction the entity had gone. The side street led to what had been a residential area. Houses with peeling paint and overgrown yards, but structures still fundamentally sound. And Catalina moved between them, looking for any sign of the impossibly tall figure. She found something else instead. A house with its front door standing open, and inside on the kitchen table sat a journal, leather-bound and old but preserved well enough to be readable. Catalina knew she was trespassing, knew she should leave private property alone, but the journal seemed deliberately placed, positioned exactly where someone entering would see it, and she couldn't resist picking it up and opening to the first page. The handwriting was shaky and difficult to read, but the date was clear enough, September 1987, and the writer identified herself as Blair, a longtime Paducah resident who'd been documenting strange events in the town. The entries started normally enough, complaints about the declining population and businesses closing, but they quickly took a darker turn. Blair wrote about seeing a tall figure in black robes appearing on the edge of town one evening in October 1987, just standing at the town limits like it was waiting for permission to enter. She'd thought it was a prank at first, maybe teenagers in a costume trying to scare people, but the figure had remained in place for 3 days straight, without moving, without eating or drinking, just standing and watching. Other residents had seen it too and were growing increasingly disturbed. And when the sheriff had driven out to investigate, he'd gotten within 50 feet of the entity before turning his car around and driving away, without explanation, refusing to discuss what he'd seen or experienced. The journal entries became more frantic as weeks passed. The figure had started moving through Paducah itself, appearing on street corners and outside homes, always silent and motionless, but somehow radiating a presence that Blair described as the weight of endings and final moments. Catalina read faster, her hands trembling as Blair's entries documented a town slowly coming apart under the influence of whatever the robed figure represented. People started leaving Paducah in the weeks after the entity arrived, packing up their homes and businesses without clear explanations, just a desperate need to be somewhere else. Blair wrote that she'd tried to leave too, had packed her car 3 different times, but each time she'd seen the figure standing in her driveway, blocking her exit, and she'd felt such overwhelming dread that she'd unpacked and tried to pretend everything was normal. The entries described others who'd attempted to leave and failed, who'd driven to the town limits only to find themselves somehow back in their own driveways with no memory of turning around, as if Paducah itself was refusing to release them. Then came the entry that made Catalina's blood run cold. Blair had realized what the figure was, or at least what it represented, and she'd written the word in capital letters underlined 3 times. Death. Not death as a metaphor or concept, but death itself. The actual entity that came to collect souls, and it had claimed Paducah as its territory for reasons Blair couldn't understand. The final entries in the journal were nearly illegible, written in a hand that shook so badly the words were barely recognizable, and Blair described seeing the figure inside her house, standing in hallways and doorways, getting closer each day. She wrote that others had stopped trying to leave, had simply accepted that Paducah belonged to death now, and they were living on borrowed time. The last entry was dated November 1987, just a single line that read, "It's standing at the foot of my bed. I don't think I'll wake up tomorrow." The journal ended there, and Catalina stood in the abandoned kitchen holding evidence of something that her rational mind couldn't accept, but that her gut knew was absolutely true. She placed the journal back on the table exactly where she'd found it and backed out of the house, and that's when she saw the figure again, this time much closer, standing in the yard of the house directly across the street. Catalina ran, abandoning all pretense of journalistic curiosity or professional documentation. Just pure animal terror driving her legs as she sprinted back toward the main street where she'd left her car. She could hear nothing behind her, no footsteps or breathing, but she felt the entity's presence like pressure building in her skull. And when she risked a glance over her shoulder, she saw it following her with that same gliding motion that covered ground impossibly fast without appearing to hurry. She burst onto the main street and saw her car still parked where she'd left it, 50 yards away, but it might as well have been 50 miles for how far it seemed. The figure appeared at the end of the street again, cutting off her direct path, and Catalina veered into the old hotel, slamming through doors that she prayed would slow the entity down, even though she knew in her heart that doors and walls probably meant nothing to whatever this thing was. The hotel interior was dark and musty, grand architecture gone to decay, and Catalina could hear her own breathing echoing off the walls, along with her footsteps as she ran through the lobby toward what she hoped was a back exit. She found a door that led to an alley, and she burst through it into the fading daylight, the sun now touching the horizon and painting everything in shades of red that looked too much like blood. The figure was waiting in the alley, and Catalina understood with absolute certainty that it had been hurting her, guiding her movements, playing with her, the way a cat plays with a mouse before the kill. She backed against the hotel wall with nowhere left to run, and the entity glided closer until it loomed over her, easily 9 feet tall up close, the darkness within its hood so absolute that looking at it made her eyes hurt. Catalina found her voice and screamed at it, demanding to know what it wanted, why it had claimed Paducah, why it was tormenting her when she'd just been trying to take photographs. The figure stopped its advance, and for a long moment nothing happened. And then Catalina heard a voice that didn't come from any mouth, a sound that existed directly in her mind, vibrating through her skull in frequencies that human vocal cords could never produce. It told her that Paducah had invited it, that the town's slow death from economic decline and population loss had created a vacuum, that entities like itself were drawn to the way sharks were drawn to blood in water. Death explained that it hadn't come to kill, but to claim territory, to make Paducah a way station between the living world and whatever came after. And the residents who'd remained had done so because some part of them recognized that they were already more dead than alive, going through the motions of existence without purpose or future. The entity said that Catalina was different, still vital and engaged with life, and she didn't belong in Paducah any more than a healthy cell belonged in dying tissue. It asked her why she'd come to places of death and abandonment, what she sought in ruins and emptiness. And Catalina found herself answering honestly, even as tears streamed down her face. She said she documented abandoned places because they reminded her that nothing lasted forever, that even things that seemed permanent and important eventually crumbled and were forgotten, and there was both terror and comfort in that impermanence. Death seemed to consider this, its hooded head tilting at an angle that shouldn't be possible for anything with a spine, and then it told Catalina that she would be allowed to leave, but she had to make a choice. She could go and forget everything she'd experienced, live her life without the knowledge of what truly haunted places like Paducah, or she could remember and carry the truth with her, but never be able to prove it or convince others of what she'd witnessed. Catalina chose memory without hesitation, saying that truth mattered more than proof, that knowing was worth the burden of being unable to share that knowledge in a way anyone would believe. The entity made a sound that might have been approval or might have been amusement, and then it extended one impossibly long arm, ending in a hand that had too many fingers, each one thin as a knife blade, and it touched Catalina's forehead with a cold that burned worse than fire. She felt something fundamental shift inside her consciousness, like a door opening in her mind that she'd never known existed, and through that door poured knowledge of all the places where death had claimed territory, all the abandoned towns and forgotten structures where entities like this one held dominion over the spaces between life and ending. Catalina came back to full awareness, lying on the ground in the alley with the sun fully set, and stars appearing in the darkening sky above Paducah. The figure was gone, and she was alone except for the certain knowledge that it was still nearby, would always be nearby as long as she remained in its territory. She stood on shaking legs and walked back to her car, and this time nothing stopped her from getting in and starting the engine and driving away from Paducah with her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She drove for 3 hours straight, putting as much distance between herself and that cursed town as possible, and she didn't stop until she reached Amarillo, where she checked into a motel and finally allowed herself to break down completely. Catalina cried for Blair and the others who'd been unable to leave, trapped in Paducah by an entity that had claimed the dying town as its own, and she cried for herself and the knowledge she now carried that would make every abandoned place she visited from now on potentially dangerous in ways she'd never imagined. She kept her promise and tried to tell people what she'd experienced, posted her story online with the photographs she'd taken, but the comments were unanimous in calling it creative fiction or accusing her of using digital manipulation to create the few images where the figure appeared as a dark blur in the background. Catalina's camera had captured almost nothing useful, as if death itself refused to be properly documented, and without evidence her story was just another internet tale of supernatural encounters that could neither be proved nor disproved. She did manage to verify some facts about Paducah. Population records showed a dramatic decline starting in late 1987, and she found an obituary for a woman named Blair who had died in her home in November of that year, cause of death listed as heart failure despite being only 47 years old with no prior cardiac issues. Catalina tried to locate the journal she'd read, but when she called the county records office, they had no information about the property or what had happened to the contents of Blair's house. The knowledge death had given her proved accurate and terrible. Catalina could now sense, when abandoned places hosted entities like the one in Paducah, could feel the weight of supernatural claims on spaces where humans no longer lived. It ruined her career in a way because she could no longer bring herself to explore half the locations she'd planned to photograph, her newly opened awareness screaming warnings about the dangers that lurked in certain ruins. She became more selective, more cautious, and her followers noticed the change in her content, complained that she'd lost her edge and wasn't taking the risks that had made her famous. Catalina tried to explain without explaining, said that wisdom meant knowing which abandoned places were truly empty and which ones were occupied by things that didn't show up on camera, but nobody understood, and her follower count declined steadily. She thought about Paducah constantly, wondered if the town was still there or if death had finally consumed it completely. And sometimes, in her dreams, she walked those empty streets again and saw the figure standing at every intersection, waiting patiently for the last human heartbeats to fade so it could have Paducah entirely to itself. Catalina never went back to verify whether her dreams were visions or just trauma-fueled nightmares, because some questions were better left unanswered, and some towns were better left to the entities that claimed them when the living finally gave up and moved on. Joy didn't believe in ghosts until she watched 12 robed figures hover 3 feet above the ground in perfect silence, their feet never touching the dried Texas earth, and realized she was witnessing something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She'd come to Barstow in Ward County as part of her doctoral research on post-disaster community dissolution, specifically focusing on towns that had been destroyed by infrastructure failures. And Barstow's story was a textbook case of how quickly prosperity could turn to dust. The town had thrived in the late 1800s with over 1,000 residents working the farms irrigated by the Pecos River. But in 1904, a dam had broken upstream, and the resulting flood had devastated the cropland, salting the earth and destroying the irrigation systems that had made agriculture possible in this harsh West Texas landscape. Within a decade, most residents had abandoned their homes, and Barstow had become another footnote in the long list of failed frontier settlements. Joy had arrived in early afternoon, parking her rental car near the scattered remains of farm buildings and homes that barely qualified as ruins anymore, most having collapsed into piles of weathered wood and rusted metal that the desert was slowly reclaiming. The October heat was oppressive despite the season, and Joy found herself drinking water constantly as she surveyed the area and took notes for her dissertation. The landscape was brutally empty, flat scrubland stretching to the horizon in every direction, dotted with the skeletal remains of structures that had once housed families and businesses and dreams of prosperity. Joy walked among the ruins, photographing foundation stones and trying to reconstruct the town's original layout from the scattered evidence. And she noticed something odd about the largest remaining structure, what appeared to have been a community building or possibly a church based on its size and central location. The building had collapsed decades ago, but the foundation formed a perfect rectangle, and in the center of that rectangle, the ground was different, darker, more disturbed, as if something had been digging there recently despite the area being abandoned for over a century. Joy knelt to examine the soil more closely, and that's when she felt the temperature drop so suddenly that her breath became visible, despite the afternoon heat still baking the surrounding landscape. She stood quickly and looked around, searching for an explanation for the sudden cold spot, and she saw them emerging from the heat shimmer on the horizon, figures in robes moving toward the ruined foundation with a strange gliding motion that became clearer as they approached. Joy's first thought was that she'd stumbled onto some kind of religious ceremony or reenactment, maybe a local historical society commemorating Barstow's past. But as the figures got closer, she realized several things simultaneously that made her blood run cold. First, there were 12 of them, all dressed identically in robes that might have been white once but were now stained brown with something that looked disturbingly like dried mud or clay. Second, they weren't walking on the ground. Their feet dangled several inches above the surface, and they moved forward without any visible means of propulsion, floating like balloons caught in a current, except there was no wind. Third, and most disturbing, Joy couldn't see their faces despite the robes having hoods that were pushed back. Where heads should have been, there was just a blurred distortion, as if her eyes refused to focus on that part of their forms. The robed figures arranged themselves in a circle around the foundation's perimeter, still hovering above the ground, and they stood there in absolute silence, while Joy watched from 30 feet away, with her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She wanted to run, wanted to get back to her car and drive away from Barstow as fast as possible. But her legs wouldn't obey her brain's commands, and she stood rooted in place as if invisible hands were holding her still. The figures began moving in a pattern, circling the foundation clockwise, and Joy realized they were searching for something, their faceless heads tilting down toward the ground in a systematic sweep. She heard sound then, though it didn't come from the figures themselves. It was a whisper that seemed to originate from the ground beneath them, hundreds or thousands of voices speaking in unison, all saying the same thing over and over: water, water, water. The chant grew louder and more desperate, and Joy understood with growing horror that she was hearing the last thoughts of people who had died of thirst, their final moments preserved in the earth itself and replaying endlessly in this cursed location. The robed figures stopped their circling and converged on the center of the foundation, where Joy had noticed the disturbed soil, and they hovered in a tight cluster above that spot, while the whispered chanting reached a crescendo that made Joy's ears ring with the desperation and anguish of it. She watched as one of the figures reached down with arms that seemed to stretch and elongate impossibly, and it plunged its hands into the earth up to the elbows, digging with movements that were more like swimming than excavating. The other figures joined in, their robed bodies now pressed against the ground they'd been hovering above, and they dug frantically while the chanting of water, water, water continued unabated. Joy found her legs would move again, and she stumbled backward away from the scene, but she couldn't look away from what the figures were unearthing. Bones, dozens of human bones, stained dark by soil and time, scattered in the shallow grave they were excavating. The figures pulled the bones from the earth with a tenderness that seemed incongruous with their faceless horror, arranging them carefully, in a pattern that Joy's mind refused to interpret as anything but a mass grave. She finally managed to turn and run, sprinting back toward her car with the chanting still echoing in her ears. But when she'd covered what should have been the 100 yards to her vehicle, she found herself standing at the foundation again. The robed figures now turned toward her in unison, despite having no visible eyes. Joyce screamed and tried running in a different direction, but every path led her back to the same spot, as if Barstow's geography had folded in on itself and trapped her in a loop with no exit. The figures began moving toward her, still floating above the ground, and Joy collapsed to her knees in the dirt with nowhere left to flee. The closest figure stopped directly in front of her, close enough that Joy could see the material of its robe was made from some kind of burlap or rough cloth that was rotted and falling apart. And when it reached toward her with one impossibly long arm, she squeezed her eyes shut and waited for whatever fate awaited people who witnessed things they weren't meant to see. The touch when it came was gentle, almost comforting. A hand on her shoulder that felt solid despite belonging to something that defied physics and reason. Joy opened her eyes and found herself looking at the figure's face, or where a face should have been, and this time, instead of blur, she saw features. A woman's face, weathered and lined with suffering, with eyes that held depths of despair Joy had never imagined possible. The woman's mouth moved and words came out, but they didn't match the movement of her lips, as if the sound was coming from somewhere else, and the face was just approximating speech. She said her name was Hazley, that she'd lived in Barstow with her family when the dam broke in 1904, and the flood hadn't just destroyed the crops and irrigation systems, it had poisoned the water supply. The residents had stayed initially believing they could rebuild and dig new wells, but well after well came up dry or brackish, undrinkable, and people started dying of thirst in the middle of a town that had been built on the promise of abundant water from the Pecos River. Hazley told Joy that she and 11 others had been the last holdouts, refusing to abandon their homes, even as their bodies began to fail from dehydration. They'd gathered in the community building and prayed for rain, for water, for salvation that never came, and they died together in that building as the Texas sun beat down mercilessly and their bodies dried out like the crops they'd tended. The building had collapsed on top of their remains, burying them in an unmarked grave that no one had bothered to excavate because Barstow had been written off as a lost cause and the dead were just more casualties of frontier life. Hazley explained that their spirits had been trapped here, bound to the location of their deaths, and they spent eternity searching for the water they'd been denied in life, hovering above ground that could no longer support them, unable to rest because they'd never received proper burial or acknowledgement of their suffering. The other figures gathered around Joy now, and she saw faces in all of them. Sarai, who'd been a teacher, Blair, who'd run the general store, Elowyn, who'd been pregnant when she died, and 9 others whose names Joy heard but couldn't retain because her mind was overloaded with information and horror. They wanted Joy to tell their story, to make sure people knew that Barstow hadn't just been abandoned due to economic factors, but had been a site of terrible suffering where people had died slow, agonizing deaths from thirst in a land that had promised water and delivered only dust. Hazley said they needed proper burial in consecrated ground so their spirits could finally release their desperate search for water that would never come, and Joy found herself nodding and promising, despite having no idea how she'd fulfill such a request. The moment she agreed, the pressure holding her in place released, and the robed figures began to fade, their forms becoming translucent and then disappearing entirely, leaving Joy alone in the ruins with the excavated bones still arranged in their terrible pattern on the ground. She stood on shaking legs and pulled out her phone, shocked to find she still had a weak signal out here in the middle of nowhere, and she called the Ward County Sheriff's Office to report the discovery of human remains in the Barstow ruins. The response took 3 hours, and by the time deputies arrived with the county medical examiner, Joy had composed herself enough to give a coherent statement about finding the bones while conducting research. She didn't mention the robed figures, or the floating, or the faceless faces that had resolved into desperate women and men who died of thirst over a century ago. The authorities were skeptical at first about how she'd known to dig in that exact spot, but when the medical examiner confirmed the bones were historical rather than recent, their interest shifted to archaeological concerns rather than criminal investigation. Joy stayed in the area for 2 more days while a team from a state university carefully excavated the site, ultimately recovering the remains of 12 individuals, 11 adults, and 1 fetus that had died in utero when its mother succumbed to dehydration. DNA analysis would take months, but the historical evidence supported Joy's research about the 1904 dam break and subsequent deaths. Joy worked with local historical societies and descendant communities to arrange proper burial for the Barstow 12, and 7 months after her initial discovery, they were interred in a cemetery in Pecos with a memorial marker that told their story and acknowledged the suffering they'd endured. Joy attended the ceremony and felt the same cold touch on her shoulder she'd experienced in Barstow, but when she turned around, no one was there, just a brief whisper of thank you carried on wind that shouldn't have been blowing in the still cemetery air. She completed her dissertation with a chapter dedicated to Barstow and the ways that infrastructure failures could trap communities in cycles of suffering that persisted long after the physical town had disappeared. And her work was praised for its sensitivity to human cost rather than just economic analysis. Joy never saw the robed figures again, never experienced another paranormal encounter despite visiting dozens of abandoned sites for her research, but she kept a photograph of the memorial marker on her office wall as a reminder that some places held suffering that needed to be witnessed and honored before the dead could finally rest. She thought about Hazley and the others often, wondered if they'd found peace after proper burial, or if they were still hovering over that cursed ground, searching for water that would never come. Joy hoped they were at rest, hoped that her intervention had freed them from their eternal desperate search. But part of her knew that some suffering was too profound to be erased by burial rituals and memorial markers. The drought that had killed Barstow was just one small tragedy in Texas history, barely worth a footnote in most historical texts. But Joy made sure it was remembered in her work, and her teaching told her students about the 12 who died of thirst while searching for salvation that never arrived. She never returned to Barstow itself, couldn't bring herself to stand again on ground that had been soaked with such desperate final moments, but she kept track of the area through historical records and meteorological data. The region remained arid, the Pecos River never recovered its flow, and Barstow's ruins continued to crumble into dust that blew across West Texas in storms that brought no rain, only wind and memories of a town that had died from thirst and been forgotten by everyone except the spirits who couldn't leave and the one researcher who'd promised to tell their story, and had kept that promise, even though it cost her sleep and peace of mind for years afterward. The air tasted like metal and madness, and by the time Adeline realized the mine's toxic breath was already inside her lungs, changing her brain chemistry with every inhalation, it was far too late to save herself from seeing what the dead miners wanted her to see. She was a geology student from the University of Texas, 23 years old and brilliant in ways that made her professors uncomfortable, and she'd driven down to Terlingua in Brewster County because her thesis focused on mercury mining operations and their environmental legacy. And Terlingua had been the epicenter of American Quicksilver production during World War I. The town sat on the edge of Big Bend National Park, a collection of ruins slowly being reclaimed by the Chihuahuan Desert, and about 100 people still lived among the abandoned buildings, running a famous chili cook-off every November that brought thousands of tourists to a place that had literally poisoned the earth beneath it. Adeline had arrived on a Tuesday morning when the October heat was already brutal, and she'd spent hours photographing the remains of the Chisos Mining Company buildings and taking soil samples that would later confirm what she already suspected. The ground was saturated with mercury residue that would take centuries to break down naturally. She'd been warned not to enter the old mine shafts, told by a local resident that the tunnels were unstable and full of toxic air that could kill someone in minutes. But Adeline was young enough to believe she was invincible and smart enough to think proper precautions would keep her safe. She'd brought a respirator mask and a portable air quality monitor, and she'd promised herself she'd only go 20 feet into the nearest tunnel, just far enough to collect rock samples from an active vein. The entrance she chose was partially collapsed but passable, a dark mouth in the hillside that exhaled air so cold it made her shiver, despite the desert heat. And Adeline clicked on her headlamp and ducked inside with her equipment bag slung over one shoulder. The tunnel was narrow and low-ceilinged, forcing her to crouch as she moved deeper, and the walls glittered with veins of cinnabar, the red mercury sulfide ore that had made Terlingua valuable and had killed so many of the men who'd extracted it. Adeline's air monitor began beeping almost immediately, detecting elevated mercury vapor levels, but the readings were still within what she'd calculated as safe exposure limits for short-term contact, so she kept moving forward. 20 feet became 30, then 50, and Adeline found herself drawn deeper into the mine by a compulsion she couldn't quite explain, a need to see what lay beyond the next curve in the tunnel. Her headlamp illuminated rough carved walls where pickaxe marks were still visible, and she could see the places where miners had followed the richest veins, chipping away at rock that glowed red like frozen blood. The temperature continued to drop the deeper she went, and Adeline realized her respirator mask had slipped down around her neck without her noticing, meaning she'd been breathing unfiltered mine air for at least the last 5 minutes. She started to turn back, recognizing that mercury exposure was affecting her decision-making. But that's when she heard the voices, dozens of them, speaking in Spanish and English, and languages she didn't recognize, overlapping whispers that seemed to come from the tunnel walls themselves. Adeline pressed her hands against the cold stone and felt vibration under her palms, as if the entire mountain was speaking, and the whispers resolved into coherent words that made her stomach clench with horror. They were warnings, desperate pleas for miners who died in these tunnels, their minds destroyed by mercury poisoning long before their bodies had given out. Adeline heard a voice that identified itself as Dario, a miner from Mexico who'd come to Terlingua in 1912 seeking work to support his family back home, and he'd spent 6 years breathing mercury vapor every day until his hands developed tremors so bad he couldn't hold a pickaxe. His gums bled constantly, and he'd started seeing things that weren't there, shadow people following him through the tunnels, walls breathing like living tissue, his own reflection speaking to him with a mouth full of silver teeth. Dario told Adeline that the mercury didn't just poison bodies, it poisoned minds, turning the minds into places where reality became negotiable, and the boundary between life and death grew thin enough that the departed could reach back through and touch the living. Another voice joined in, a man named Coulson, who'd worked for the Chisos Mining Company during World War I, when production had ramped up to meet wartime demand, and safety protocols had been abandoned in favor of maximum extraction. Coulson described watching co-workers develop the characteristic mercury poisoning symptoms, the tremors, the personality changes, the hallucinations, the madness that came on so gradually nobody noticed until someone was found in the tunnels talking to corpses that had been dead for years. Adeline tried to back out of the tunnel, but her legs wouldn't cooperate properly, and she realized the mercury exposure was more severe than she'd calculated, that her symptoms were already manifesting in loss of motor control and sensory distortions. The tunnel seemed to stretch and contract around her like a throat swallowing, and she saw figures emerging from the walls, miners with faces that were half flesh and half cinnabar crystal, their eyes reflecting her headlamp beam like animals caught in car headlights. They weren't threatening, but they weren't friendly either, just present in a way that made Adeline understand she was seeing across the barrier between living and dead, and the mercury in her bloodstream was acting as a chemical key that unlocked perception of the spirits who'd been trapped in these tunnels since their poisoned deaths. More voices joined the chorus, telling her their names and their stories. Eliseo, who'd gone mad and killed 3 other miners before hanging himself from a support beam. Mauricio, who'd developed tremors so bad he'd accidentally struck a gas pocket and caused an explosion that collapsed an entire section of tunnel with 12 men inside. Danny, who'd simply walked deeper and deeper into the mines one day and never come back out, his mercury-addled mind deciding that going forward was better than facing the world above, that he no longer recognized as real. The spirit showed Adeline things she didn't want to see. Visions of mining operations where immigrant workers were treated as disposable resources, paid in company scrip that kept them perpetually in debt, housed in buildings that were barely better than animal pens, and exposed to toxins that the company knew were deadly, but accepted as the cost of doing business. She saw men coughing up blood and mercury, saw children playing in tailings, piles contaminated with heavy metals, saw pregnant women giving birth to babies whose brains had been damaged in utero by their mother's mercury exposure. 40% of American quicksilver during World War I had come from Terlingua, and the human cost of that production was written in ruined mines and poisoned bodies and families destroyed by industrial greed that valued profit over every other consideration. Adeline felt tears streaming down her face as the visions continued, and she tried to ask the spirits what they wanted from her, why they were showing her these horrors. And the answer came from all of them, speaking in unison. They wanted to be remembered, wanted someone to bear witness to the fact that Terlingua's wealth had been built on suffering that continued long after the mines had closed, and the company had abandoned the workers who'd made them rich. Adeline's air monitor was screaming now, indicating mercury vapor levels that were far beyond safe exposure limits, and she understood with absolute clarity that she was going to die in this tunnel if she didn't get out immediately. She forced her legs to move, crawling when walking became impossible, dragging herself toward the entrance that seemed impossibly far away. The spectral miners followed her, their whispers becoming urgent and insistent, and Adeline realized they were trying to help her now, guiding her through sections where the tunnel floor had collapsed or support beams had rotted through. She heard Dario telling her to go left at the next fork, heard Coulson warning her about a deep shaft hidden by shadows, heard Eliseo urging her to keep moving even when her body wanted to stop and rest. The entrance appeared ahead, a circle of brutal desert sunlight that hurt her mercury-sensitized eyes, and Adeline pulled herself through the opening and collapsed on the rocky ground outside, gasping for air that didn't taste like metal and death. She lay there for what might have been minutes or hours, time becoming elastic and unreliable as the mercury in her system continued affecting her perception. And when she finally gathered enough strength to sit up, she saw a figure sitting on a rock nearby watching her. It was an old man, weathered and sun-dark, wearing clothes that looked like they came from a thrift store, and he had a bucket beside him full of rattlesnakes that writhed and coiled over each other. The man introduced himself as Keanu, said he lived in Terlingua, year-round catching rattlesnakes and selling them to collectors, and he told Adeline she was lucky to be alive because most people who went into those mines didn't come back out sane. Keanu said he'd been watching the entrance for about 3 hours, waiting to see if she'd emerge, or if he'd need to call for help to recover another body from the tunnels. and Adeline realized she'd been underground far longer than she'd intended, that the time distortion was another symptom of mercury poisoning affecting her brain chemistry. Keanu helped her to her car and drove her to the nearest medical facility in Alpine, an hour away, where doctors confirmed acute mercury exposure and admitted her for chelation therapy to remove the heavy metals from her bloodstream. Adeline spent 4 days in the hospital receiving treatment, and the entire time she could hear the whispers of the dead miners, their voices following her even out of the tunnels, as if the mercury in her body had created a permanent link between her consciousness and theirs. The doctors told her the auditory hallucinations would fade as the chelation reduced her mercury levels, but they persisted even after treatment. Quieter, but never entirely gone. And Adeline understood that something fundamental had changed in her brain chemistry that no medical intervention could fully reverse. She went back to Austin to recover and tried to resume her normal life, but she couldn't focus on her coursework anymore because every time she looked at geological samples, she heard whispers telling her about the men who died extracting those minerals. And every time she read about mining operations, she saw visions of poisoned workers and contaminated environments. Adeline changed her thesis focus from technical geology to environmental justice, specifically examining the human cost of extractive industries and the legacy of industrial poisoning in abandoned mining communities. She returned to Terlingua 6 months later, fully recovered from the acute mercury exposure, but still hearing occasional whispers when she stood near the old mine entrances. And she spent weeks interviewing the residents who still live there, many of them descendants of miners who'd worked during the Quicksilver boom. She documented stories of neurological problems that ran in families, of children born with developmental delays, of adults developing tremors and cognitive issues despite never having worked in the mines themselves, all evidence of multi-generational mercury exposure that the mining companies had never acknowledged or compensated. Adeline's thesis became a book that was published by a university press, and an entire section was dedicated to the voices of the dead miners. Not literally, she was too scientifically trained to claim actual supernatural contact, but as a metaphorical framework for understanding how industrial violence echoed across generations. She included the names that the spirits had given her and managed to verify most of them through historical records. Dario really had worked at the Chizos Mining Company from 1912 to 1918. Coulson had died in a mine collapse in 1917. Eliseo's murder-suicide was documented in contemporary newspaper accounts. Mauricio had indeed caused an explosion, though records said it was accidental, and Danny had disappeared in the mines in 1919 with his body never recovered. Adeline felt like she was honoring the promise she'd made to the spirits, even if she couldn't publicly acknowledge their supernatural assistance, and she hoped that being remembered in her academic work would give them some measure of peace. The whispers faded gradually over the course of several years, until they were just occasional echoes in her mind, easily dismissed as intrusive thoughts rather than actual communication from the dead. But Adeline never forgot what she'd experienced in the Terlingua tunnels, or the visions of suffering that mercury poisoning had unlocked in her perception. She became an advocate for cleaning up abandoned mine sites and compensating communities affected by industrial contamination, and she testified before congressional committees about the ongoing public health crisis created by mercury residue in places like Terlingua, where tourists and residents alike were exposed to toxic legacy pollution. Adeline never entered another mine shaft for the rest of her life, too aware of how quickly the air could poison both body and mind, but she drove past the Terlingua ruins every few years and always stopped to stand outside the entrance where she'd nearly died. She'd pour water on the ground as an offering, water being precious in the desert and the thing that miners had needed most to wash the mercury dust from their skin and throats. And she'd speak the names aloud that the spirits had taught her, making sure they continued to be remembered by at least one living person who understood what they'd endured. The Quicksilver whispers stayed quiet during these visits, and Adeline chose to interpret that silence as gratitude or peace rather than absence. And she told herself that bearing witness to suffering was sometimes the only gift the living could give to the dead who'd been forgotten by everyone except the poisoned ground that still held their bones and the mercury vapor that still carried their voices to anyone foolish or brave enough to breathe deep in the darkness of abandoned mines. Zariah felt the ground shift beneath her boots, like something alive was breathing underneath the earth. And she understood in that moment of sinking terror that the Canadian River hadn't forgotten how to claim victims, even after more than a century of practice. She was a historian specializing in frontier settlement patterns, 31 years old and stubbornly independent in ways that had served her well in academic circles, but left her vulnerable in situations where caution should have overruled curiosity. Zariah had spent months researching Barney Plemons, a legendary figure in Texas panhandle history who'd operated a crossing service over the Canadian River in the 1880s, using a horse that could supposedly sense quicksand and guide travelers safely across the treacherous bogs that dotted the river bottom. The town that had grown around Plemons Crossing had thrived briefly, serving cowboys driving cattle north and settlers heading west, but it had died when the railroad bypassed the area and alternative crossings became available. What remained of Plemons was now on private property, legally inaccessible to researchers. But Zariah had driven up from Amarillo anyway, because sometimes the best historical discoveries required bending rules about trespassing and private property rights. She'd parked her truck a mile away and hiked across scrubland to reach what her research suggested was the location of the original crossing. And she'd been thrilled to find foundations still visible and even a few weathered grave markers in what had been the town cemetery. The graves were what had drawn her attention first, an unusual number of children and infants, several marked as twins, and the dates clustered in ways that suggested epidemic or disaster rather than natural mortality spread over years. Zariah photographed every marker and took rubbings of the inscriptions that were still legible, noting names like Nyla and Emmy and Cameron, children who died in 1886 and 1887, their short lives ending in this remote panhandle outpost for reasons the simple headstones didn't explain. She'd been so focused on the cemetery that she hadn't noticed how close she'd wandered to the river, until she looked up and realized the Canadian was right in front of her, maybe 30 yards away, its banks lined with cottonwood trees, and its surface moving with deceptive laziness that disguised the dangerous currents and hidden bogs beneath. Zariah knew she should stay away from the water. Her research had made clear that the Canadian River was notorious for quicksand and had claimed dozens of lives over the years. But she wanted to see the actual crossing point, wanted to stand where Barney Plemons had stood when he'd guided travelers across with his remarkable horse. She approached carefully, testing each step before committing her weight, and the ground seemed solid enough, firm sand and gravel with scattered rocks. She reached the bank and looked out across the river, trying to imagine what it would have been like to cross here in a wagon with all your possessions and your family, trusting your life to a stranger's horse and its supposed ability to sense danger beneath the surface. The water was maybe 20 feet wide at this point, shallow enough that Zariah could see the bottom in most places, and she thought about wading across to examine the far bank, where she'd seen what might be more foundation stones. It was a stupid idea, reckless in ways that made her hesitate, but Zariah had always been someone who pushed boundaries and took risks, and this seemed manageable if she was careful. She took her first step into the water and immediately felt wrongness. The riverbed beneath her boots shifted slightly. Not solid rock or packed sand, but something that had give to it, something that moved. Zariah tried to pull her foot back, but it had already sunk 3 inches into what she now recognized as quicksand. And when she jerked backward, her other foot broke through the surface crust and plunged into the bog. Panic flooded her system as she felt herself sinking, not dramatically fast, like in movies, but steadily, inexorably, the sand sucking at her legs with pressure that increased the more she struggled. Zariah forced herself to stop moving, remembering half-forgotten advice about quicksand requiring you to spread your weight and move slowly, but she'd already sunk to her knees, and the suction was so strong she couldn't lift either leg. She looked around desperately for something to grab, a branch or root system she could use to pull herself out, but the bank was just beyond her reach, and the cottonwood trees might as well have been miles away. The river crossing was claiming her exactly as it had claimed so many others, and Zariah felt tears of frustration and fear streaming down her face as she continued sinking, now past her knees, toward her thighs. She pulled out her phone to call for help, but of course, there was no signal out here in the middle of nowhere on private property where she shouldn't have been in the first place, and she understood that she was probably going to die in this river, and her body might never be found, just another victim swallowed by the Canadian and its hidden bogs. That's when she heard the crying, children's voices, high and frightened, calling for help in words that sounded muffled as if coming from underwater. Zariah looked around wildly, searching for the source, and she saw them rising from the river around her, children, transparent and wavering like reflections on disturbed water, their faces showing the terror of drowning, their small hands reaching up toward air they could no longer breathe. There were at least a dozen of them, maybe more, appearing and disappearing as the water rippled around Zariah's sinking form, and she recognized with horror that these were the children from the cemetery, the ones who died in 1886 and 1887, and they hadn't died from epidemic or accident, but from the river itself. The spectral children surrounded Zariah as she continued to sink, now buried to her waist, and they didn't try to help her escape, but instead seemed to be pulling her down, their translucent hands gripping her arms and legs and adding their weight to the quicksand suction. Zariah screamed and thrashed, abandoning the advice about staying calm, pure survival instinct taking over, as she fought against both the bog and the ghostly children, who wanted her to join them in their watery grave. She felt hands under the surface now, adult-sized hands grabbing at her ankles and feet, and she understood that the children weren't the only victims the river held. There were others down there in the sand and mud, travelers who'd trusted Barney Plemons and his horse but had died anyway when the crossing betrayed them. Their bodies never recovered because the quicksand wouldn't release what it had claimed. One of the children spoke, a little girl who looked like Nyla from the grave markers, and she told Zariah in a voice like wind through reeds that the cemetery was full of lies, that the children hadn't died from fever or accident, but from being pulled into the river when their families tried to cross, that their parents had marked them as epidemic victims because admitting the truth, that they'd trusted the wrong guide at the wrong time, was too painful. Zariah was buried to her chest now, her arms pinned against her sides by the pressure of the sand, and she could feel water seeping up through the bog, filling the spaces around her body. And she knew she had minutes at most before she was completely submerged. The hands beneath the surface pulled harder, and Zariah felt herself being drawn not just down but sideways, deeper into the river channel, where the bog was deepest and had accumulated over a century of victims. She saw more spirits now, adults joining the children, a woman who looked like Lorelei crying for babies she couldn't save, a man who resembled Boston screaming warnings that came too late, twins who might have been Camden and Crew clinging to each other even in death, all of them trapped in the river's quicksand and desperate for company in their eternal drowning. Zariah's lungs were burning from hyperventilation and terror, and she tried one more time to break free, throwing all her strength into a violent twist that should have been impossible with the bog's grip on her body. And something gave, not the quicksand releasing her, but something breaking inside her shoulder with a pop of tearing ligaments that made her scream in pain. The pain shocked her system into a different kind of clarity, and Zariah stopped fighting the downward pull and instead tried to angle her body differently, remembering belatedly that quicksand was denser than human bodies, and people could float in it if they could get horizontal instead of vertical. She forced herself to lean backward, despite every instinct screaming that laying down in the bog was suicide, and she felt the pressure change slightly, the suction becoming less concentrated. The spectral hands seemed confused by her new position, their grips loosening as Zariah managed to get one arm free and then the other, and she spread them wide to distribute her weight across more surface area. The children's spirits backed away, their crying fading to whispers, and Zariah realized they hadn't been trying to kill her, but to communicate the only way they knew how, by making her experience what they'd experienced, by pulling her down into drowning so she'd understand what had really happened at Plemons Crossing. Zariah floated in the quicksand, her body horizontal now with only her face above the surface, and she moved with agonizing slowness toward the bank, swimming through sand, using tiny movements that wouldn't break the surface tension and cause her to sink again. Every inch was agony, her dislocated shoulders screaming with each motion, but she kept moving because the alternative was joining the spirits permanently in their sandy grave. It took what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes for Zariah to reach solid ground, and when she finally pulled herself onto the bank, she collapsed and sobbed with relief and pain and trauma. The spectral children watched from the water's edge, their transparent forms flickering in the afternoon sunlight. And Zariah saw sadness in their faces rather than malice, saw the desperate need to be remembered, and acknowledged that she'd seen in other hauntings she'd researched. She promised them through tears and gasping breaths that she'd tell their story, that she'd make sure people knew the truth about how they'd died, and the spirits faded back into the river like they'd never been there at all. Zariah lay on the bank until she had enough strength to stand, and then she stumbled back across the scrubland to her truck, with her left arm hanging useless and her clothes caked with drying mud. She drove herself to the emergency room in Amarillo, where doctors relocated her shoulder and treated her for exposure and minor hypothermia. And she told them she'd fallen while hiking and gotten stuck in mud, which was technically true if you left out all the supernatural elements. Zariah spent 3 days in the hospital, and during that time she researched everything she could find about deaths at Plemons Crossing, finding newspaper accounts from the 1880s that confirmed her worst suspicions. The children's deaths hadn't been epidemics at all. They'd been drownings, whole families attempting to cross the Canadian River, and losing their youngest members to quicksand bogs that opened suddenly beneath wagons or dragged small bodies under before parents could react. The graves, marked as twins, were actually siblings who died together, their parents unable to save both when the crossing went wrong, and the clustering of deaths in 1886 and 1887 corresponded to particularly wet years when the river's channels had shifted and created new bog zones that even Barney Plemons and his famous horse couldn't detect. She found Barney's own account in a memoir published years later, where he admitted that for all his horse's supposed abilities, they lost at least 20 people to the quicksand during the years he operated the crossing, and he'd carried the guilt of those deaths until his own in 1904. Barney had described the way the river seemed to hunt for victims, how bogs would appear overnight in places that had been safe the day before, how sometimes the sand would pull bodies down so deep they could never be recovered, and how he'd heard crying from the water on nights when he was alone at the crossing. Zariah compiled all this information into a research paper that she submitted to a Texas history journal, and she included a detailed analysis of the Plemons cemetery that revealed the truth about the children's deaths. She contacted descendants of the families who'd lost children at the crossing, found a few who'd maintained oral histories about the drownings that contradicted the official epidemic story, and she helped arrange for new cemetery markers that told the truth. These children had died in the Canadian River, victims of a frontier crossing that had been necessary but deadly, and they deserved to be remembered accurately rather than hidden behind face-saving lies. Zariah never went back to Plemons, couldn't bring herself to stand near that river again or test her luck against quicksand that had already tried to claim her once. Her shoulder healed, but never quite right, a permanent reminder of how close she'd come to joining the spirits in their sandy grave, and she developed a phobia of water that made even crossing bridges an anxious experience. She thought about the children constantly, wondered if telling their story had given them peace, or if they were still trapped in the river, pulling at anyone foolish enough to approach the crossing. Zariah included warnings in her published research about the ongoing danger of quicksand at the Canadian River, specifically noting that the bogs were still active and still dangerous despite Plemons Crossing being abandoned for over a century, and she hoped that would prevent future deaths even if it couldn't save those who'd already been claimed. The spectral children visited her dreams occasionally, always crying for help, always reaching up through water and sand, and Zariah would wake gasping as if she were drowning again, her therapist saying it was PTSD from the near-death experience, but Zariah knowing it was something more, a permanent connection to the spirits she'd encountered that couldn't be severed by distance or time. She kept a photograph of the cemetery on her desk, all those small graves marking lives cut short by a river that didn't care about human plans or careful preparations, and she made sure every student she taught learned about Plemons Crossing and the children who died there, turning her trauma into a teaching moment that honored the dead by keeping their memory alive in ways the original grave markers never had. The wind started howling from a clear blue sky, and that's when Opal knew she'd stepped into something that transcended normal weather patterns and entered the realm of temporal storms that replayed catastrophes on an endless loop. She was a storm chaser with 12 years of experience tracking tornadoes and hurricanes across the southern United States, and she'd come to the Matagorda Bay coastline specifically to visit the historical marker that was all that remained of Indianola, once the second largest port in Texas, before two Category 4 hurricanes in 1875 and 1886 had erased it so completely that nothing remained above ground. Opal had been fascinated by Indianola since childhood, captivated by the idea that an entire city could be swept into the Gulf of Mexico with such totality that even its location became disputed, with historians arguing over where exactly the port had stood before the storms consumed it. She'd driven down from Houston on a calm October morning with weather forecasts promising sunny skies and gentle breezes, perfect conditions for exploring the coastline, and using ground-penetrating radar to search for underwater ruins that might still exist beneath the waves. The historical marker stood near the waterline, a metal plaque on a post that recounted Indianola's brief prosperity and violent death, and Opal had been photographing it when the wind had appeared from nowhere, roaring like a freight train, despite the weather radar on her phone showing completely clear conditions for 100 miles in every direction. She looked up at the sky expecting to see storm clouds forming, but there was nothing except brilliant blue and a sun that beat down with typical Texas Gulf Coast intensity. The wind grew stronger, tearing at Opal's clothes and hair, and she tasted salt spray despite being 50 yards from the water's edge, as if storm surge was already pushing inland. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds, and Opal's professional instincts kicked in. She pulled out her portable weather station and confirmed what her senses were telling her, that wind speeds were reaching 70 miles per hour and atmospheric pressure was plummeting, all signs of a major storm system that didn't exist according to any meteorological data she could access. Opal turned toward her truck, recognizing that she needed to evacuate immediately regardless of whether she understood what was happening. But the landscape had changed around her in the few seconds she'd looked away. The empty coastline was gone, replaced by a bustling port city that hadn't existed moments before. Wooden buildings lining streets, ships docked at wharves, people in 1870s, clothing rushing through the wind-whipped rain that was now falling in sheets despite the sky above still showing clear blue. Opal stood frozen in shock as she watched Indianola materialize around her, not ghostly or transparent, but solid and real, and she understood with growing horror that she'd somehow slipped into the past, into the actual storm that had destroyed the city in 1875 or 1886. The wind was hurricane force now, ripping boards from buildings and sending debris flying through the air like missiles, and Opal watched in helpless terror as a wooden beam crashed through a window 10 feet from where she stood, followed by screams from inside the building as people tried to shelter from the impossible storm. The storm surge came next, a wall of water that appeared on the horizon and rushed toward the city with the speed and inevitability of an avalanche. And Opal finally broke from her paralysis and ran, sprinting inland away from the advancing water. Even though she had no idea where she was running or if escape was even possible, the people of Indianola ran with her, families clutching children, men carrying whatever possessions they could grab, everyone's faces showing the same expression of absolute terror as they fled the hurricane that was devouring their city. Opal saw a woman who looked like Kira stumble and fall, saw the storm surge sweep over her and drag her away, saw a man who resembled Demi trying to hold onto a lamppost as the water reached his chest, then his neck, then closed over his head. The devastation was total and immediate. Buildings collapsed as the surge hit them. Ships were torn from their moorings and hurled inland to smash through structures that had survived the wind. And everywhere Opal looked, people were drowning, thousands of them. Their screams cut short as the Gulf of Mexico reclaimed land that should never have been settled so close to the water. Opal found herself waist-deep in surging water, fighting to stay upright as the current tried to sweep her away, and she grabbed onto what had been a fence post to anchor herself against the flow. The water was full of debris, lumber and furniture and bodies. So many bodies, adults and children tumbling past in the violent current, like dolls discarded by an angry child. She saw faces in the water, mouths open in silent screams, eyes staring with the blank shock of people who died too fast to process what was killing them. And Opal realized she was watching the actual historical storm, witnessing the deaths of real people whose names were recorded in casualty lists, but whose suffering had been reduced to statistics in history books. A small hand grabbed her arm, and Opal looked down to see a child, maybe 7 years old, desperately trying to stay above the water that was rising with each second. Opal pulled the child up and held them against her chest. This little one who looked exactly like Cameron must have looked in 1875, and she tried to move toward higher ground, even though she had no idea which direction that might be in a city that was being systematically destroyed around her. The eye of the hurricane passed over, bringing a sudden eerie calm that was more terrifying than the wind had been, and Opal stood in chest-deep water, holding the child, and looking at devastation so complete it seemed apocalyptic. Every building was damaged or destroyed, bodies floated everywhere, and the few survivors she could see were shell-shocked and bleeding, moving through the wreckage like zombies, unable to process what had just happened. Then the eye wall hit from the opposite direction, winds that felt even stronger than before, and the water that had started to recede came rushing back with renewed violence. Opal lost her grip on the fence post and was swept away, still clutching the child, tumbling through water, so full of debris that every second brought new impacts that bruised and cut her. She went under and came up gasping, under again and fought her way to the surface, and through it all she held on to the child, who'd gone limp in her arms, but whose heart she could still feel beating against her chest. Opal slammed into something solid, a building that was somehow still standing, and she wrapped her free arm around what felt like a window frame and held on with every bit of strength she possessed. The storm raged around her, for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. And she watched the complete destruction of Indianola, saw the port city that had been Texas's gateway to the world reduced to floating wreckage and drowned corpses. When the wind finally began to diminish, Opal was one of maybe 100 people still alive out of the thousands who'd been in the city when the hurricane struck, and she still held the child who'd miraculously survived despite everything. She pulled herself and her burden through the receding water toward what looked like higher ground, and that's when reality fractured, and she found herself back in the present day, standing on an empty coastline with no buildings, no water higher than normal tide levels, and no child in her arms. Opal collapsed to her knees in the sand, gasping and sobbing, her body aching from impacts and exertion that shouldn't have been possible if the storm had been hallucination or vision. Her clothes were soaked with salt water, and she was bleeding from cuts on her arms and legs, physical evidence that what she'd experienced had been real in some way that transcended normal temporal boundaries. She looked at the historical marker and saw names carved into the metal that she didn't remember seeing before. Names of people who died in the storms, including one that made her heart stop. Cameron Rodriguez, age 7, drowned in the 1875 hurricane. Opal touched the name with shaking fingers and felt an electric shock of recognition, knowing with absolute certainty that this was the child she'd held, the little one she'd tried to save, and understanding that she'd failed because Cameron had died in 1875, and no amount of desperate effort from someone existing 150 years in the future could change that fact. She drove back to Houston in a daze, still wearing her salt-encrusted clothes, and she went straight to the university library to research the Indianola hurricanes in detail. The historical records confirmed her experience in ways that made her question everything she thought she knew about time and reality. The 1875 storm had hit exactly as she'd witnessed, with the same wind patterns and storm surge height, and the casualty lists included all the names and faces she remembered seeing in her temporal vision. Opal found photographs from after the storm, images of devastation so complete that rebuild had been attempted, but ultimately abandoned after the 1886 hurricane struck with even greater violence and convinced the few remaining residents that Indianola was cursed, ground that the Gulf of Mexico would never allow humans to occupy. She found Cameron's name in multiple records, a child who'd been visiting the port with her family when the storm hit, whose body had been recovered 3 days later, washed up on a beach 5 miles from where the city had stood, and Opal wept for that little one whose death she'd witnessed but been powerless to prevent. The temporal storm experience broke something in Opal's relationship with weather, transforming her from someone who chased storms with excitement and scientific detachment into someone who understood the true human cost of natural disasters. She couldn't look at hurricane forecasts anymore without seeing Cameron's face, couldn't track storm systems without thinking about all the people whose lives would be destroyed when wind and water exceeded safe limits. Opal quit storm chasing and took a job with FEMA working on hurricane preparedness and evacuation planning, channeling her experience into something that might actually save lives rather than just documenting destruction. She visited the Indianola marker every year on the anniversary of the 1875 storm, leaving flowers and toys on the beach for Cameron and all the other children who drowned when the hurricanes took everything, and she always felt wind rising from clear skies during those visits, always heard distant screaming that might have been seabirds or might have been the echoes of thousands dying in storm surge that replayed eternally on that cursed coastline. Opal never told anyone about experiencing the temporal storm, knowing she'd be dismissed as delusional or attention-seeking, but she wrote detailed accounts in private journals that she locked away with instructions for them to be donated to Texas Historical Archives after her death. She wanted there to be some record of what she'd witnessed, some testimony from someone who'd experienced the Indianola hurricanes, not as history, but as immediate horrifying present, and she hoped that future researchers might take her accounts seriously, even if her contemporaries wouldn't. The cuts and bruises from her time in the storm healed within weeks, but Opal developed a phobia of water that made living on the Gulf Coast intolerable, and she eventually moved to San Antonio, where the nearest ocean was far enough away that she could pretend it didn't exist. She still dreamed about the storm, though, still felt the weight of Cameron in her arms and the violence of water trying to tear them apart. And she'd wake up gasping and soaked with sweat that her sleeping mind insisted was salt water from a hurricane that had killed thousands 150 years before she was born. The meteorological community eventually learned about Opal's Indianola experience through leaked journal entries that someone found and shared online, and the response was exactly what she'd feared: mockery and dismissal, accusations of mental instability or elaborate hoaxing, demands for proof that she couldn't provide because temporal anomalies didn't leave evidence that skeptics would accept. Opal weathered the professional damage to her reputation and continued her FEMA work, and she found some vindication years later when other people started reporting similar experiences at the Indianola site: temporal displacements where they witnessed the historical storms, physical injuries that appeared during visions of the hurricanes, encounters with victims who died over a century ago but seemed desperately real in the moment. A paranormal research team investigated and confirmed unusual electromagnetic readings at the location, energy patterns that suggested some kind of temporal thinning where past and present overlapped. And while that wasn't scientific proof of what Opal had experienced, it at least suggested she hadn't been hallucinating or lying. She retired from FEMA at 62 and spent her final years writing a book about Indianola that combined historical research with her personal testimony about the temporal storm. And it was published by a small press that specialized in unusual history and paranormal accounts. The book found an audience among people interested in both Texas history and unexplained phenomena, and Opal received letters from others who'd experienced temporal anomalies at disaster sites, people who'd witnessed past tragedies replaying themselves and carried the trauma of events they'd never actually lived through, but had somehow experienced anyway. She died at 71, and her obituary mentioned her early career in storm chasing and her later FEMA work, but said nothing about Indianola or temporal hurricanes or the child named Cameron who died in her arms across a gap of 150 years. But those who knew her story made sure she was buried facing the Gulf of Mexico, and they left toys on her grave for the children she'd tried to save, and sometimes visitors reported hearing wind rising from clear skies and feeling salt spray despite being miles inland, as if the storms that took Indianola were still raging somewhere just beyond the edge of normal perception, waiting for the next person foolish or unlucky enough to step across the temporal boundary and witness destruction that refused to stay buried in the past. If Sage hadn't tripped on a tree root that hadn't been there a minute before, she might never have realized that something in Sherwood's forest was actively moving to keep her in, rather than just growing wild after more than 100 years of abandonment. Sage was an environmental blogger, used to hiking and documenting the slow return of nature across old settlements. Her life spent finding beauty in places most people saw as nothing but overgrown ruin. Sherwood, once the county seat of Eerie County, Texas, had been thriving at the start of the 20th century, a hopeful blend of stone, courthouse, modest homes, and dusty main streets set among the post-oak and hackberry woodlands of central West Texas. But like so many towns that depended on railroads that never came, Sherwood shrank, dried out, and emptied. For decades, everything that was built by human hands was steadily consumed, smothered, and tangled by the ancient forest, until only foundation stones and a single preserved courthouse remained as markers in a sea of green. The sense of tension set in early. Sage had planned a quick trip, snap some drone shots, map the reclaimed town, gather material for an article on how aggressive forest growth could erase all traces of the past. She'd followed a well-marked wildlife path on arrival, but after just 20 minutes of exploration, she realized her GPS wouldn't load. Her phone flickered with static, even though the battery was full and the skies were clear. A heavy scent of loam filled her nose, far more pungent than expected, and the forest seemed unusually dense, trees knitted so tightly together that only narrow shafts of sunlight reached the green gloom below. Reedy songs of birds echoed, but the undercurrent was wrong. No scrap of distant road noise, no planes, not even a whine from a single cicada. Saige felt isolated, and yet acutely observed, as if a million hidden eyes in the bark and leaf canopies watched her walk. The deeper she pushed in, the more she noticed unnatural patterns among the trunks. Bark that formed faces in profile with empty eye sockets, a tangle of branches forming the outline of a human hand, one moment then dissolving into randomness when she stared too long. Her boots snagged roots that seemed to arch up to catch her, and thorns dug into her clothes with the insistence of small, wanting fingers. At first, Sage tried to catalog these incidents in her notebook, certain they were tricks of stress or light. But as the hours dragged, her uneasiness grew to physical discomfort. Somewhere in the distance, as afternoon waned, she heard a short, sharp yell, a wordless cry. And when she called back, there was only silence, then the slow crackle of something heavy moving in the brush. When Saige tried to turn back, the route she'd marked with orange tape was gone. The strips she'd tied to branches had vanished, as if the forest itself had quietly plucked them away. With panic rising, Sager attempted to carve a fresh path, using her multi-tool to hack through undergrowth. But the woods closed in behind her, cut branches knitting back together before she could process how fast the regrowth happened. Every time she used her phone to try to call out, the signal pinwheeled and died. In her haste, she tripped over a low branch and tumbled down a slope, landing hard beside an outcrop of limestone that jutted like a grave marker from the soil. The impact dazed her, and for a few moments she simply lay there, staring up through a break in the canopy that framed a patch of blue sky. When she rolled over, her hand landed on something smooth and cool, the unmistakable roundness of a human skull, tinged green with moss, tangled in roots that laced through its eye sockets as if the bones had grown from the very earth. Saji recoiled in horror, but then curiosity forced her to look closer. The skull wasn't alone. All around the foundation stone where she'd landed, fragments of bone were embedded in the soil, many fused so thoroughly with roots and vines that they looked more plant than human. She realized these were not just ancient burials, but remnants of settlers who'd vanished when Sherwood was abandoned, their remains now half-digested by an ecosystem that had literally absorbed them. The realization dawned in her foggy mind. The forest here was predatory, not passively reclaiming the town, but actively seeking to erase all signs of human interference, even down to the bodies of those who'd tried to resist leaving. Before Saige could scramble up, the ground hummed, and the trees around her groaned as their branches bent and twisted, crowding her into the depression by the limestone. Trunks pressed closer, leaves whispering like a crowd urging a sacrifice. She could feel her limbs growing numb, as if something in the ground was leeching her strength. She saw faces in the bark that matched old sepia portraits of Sherwood settlers she'd seen in county archives, their features sad and resigned, as if asking for forgiveness. As night fell, fireflies began to blink in clusters, making constellations along the ground, and Saig understood that this was the only light, the only recognition bestowed on those buried in the roots of a vengeful wood. She tried to yell for help, but the forest swallowed her voice. When she attempted to crawl away, vines coiled gently around her wrists and legs, not sharply enough to injure, but persistent as restraints, guiding her back to the outcrop. Exhausted and desperate, Saige pleaded aloud with the forest. "What do you want?" And the response was felt, not heard, a deep presence in the earth and trees conveying indignation, as if the land resented the arrogance of settlers who thought they could tame it, of loggers who'd toppled giants, of planners who drew lines on maps as if the woods could ever truly be owned. The intensity of the presence built to a crescendo until Sage, delirious and sobbing, promised out loud to tell the world what Sherwood's forest had become, a living thing, an ecosystem with a will and appetite of its own, capable of erasing history, stone by stone, bone by bone. At this moment of surrender, the vines retreated. The forest seemed to sigh, branches parting to allow a faint trail of fireflies leading up the slope. Sage gathered what remained of her strength, scrambled after the lights, and stumbled onto an overgrown path that wound back toward the one structure not claimed entirely by the wood. The courthouse, now an island in a churn of green, its stone walls streaked with lichen but untouched, as if preserved by the forest, to remind passers-by of what it could devour. By the time she emerged, it was dawn, and her hair and boots were ruined, her skin scored by dozens of cuts, her notebook and phone gone, claimed forever by the greedy soil. She staggered back to her vehicle as the silence around Sherwood broke. Birds sang again, sunlight warmed clearings, and the sense of menace faded. But in every step she took, Sage felt the weight of her promise. The story would not let her go until it was told. She returned to civilization, wrote her article, and included the images that her drone, lost in the forest but uploading automatically to the cloud, had captured. Unnatural root patterns, buildings becoming indistinguishable from trees, a sunken clearing where bones were arranged almost artfully among wildflowers. Her story on Sherwood went viral, sparking debates about environmental stewardship, haunted locales, and whether wild places could actually turn hostile after centuries of exploitation. Emails poured in from readers who felt they, too, had been watched in the woods or had fled from paths that seemed to close behind them. Saiga never went back. Nightmares of the forest's shifting face and root-laced skulls ensured she'd never set foot near Eerie County again. But every spring, on the anniversary of her escape, a bouquet of wildflowers grew by that courthouse, brighter than anywhere else in the county, as if the forest acknowledged her promise, kept and allowed one tiny corner of memory, painful but intact, to remain above ground. Stories like Sage's remind us that some places refuse to be forgotten, and that the line between human history and nature's power is much thinner than we wish to believe. If you've ever felt something ancient staring back through the trees, if you believe every forest holds secrets, then subscribe to Verified Souls. Join the journey through haunted ruins, lost towns, and the shadows between the past and the wild unknown. Share your own story below and help us keep these lost voices alive, because sometimes all the forgotten want is for someone to listen, remember, and never look away.